Part 1. Introduction: The Human Quest for Meaning. In the early hours of a sleepless night, when the noise of daily life falls silent and we find ourselves alone with our thoughts, a peculiar question often emerges from the depths of consciousness. Why am I here? This question, as old as human awareness itself, carries with it the weight of our entire existence. It is not merely an intellectual curiosity, but a visceral demand that seems to rise from the very core of what makes us human. Unlike other creatures that appear to live seamlessly within the flow of their biological imperatives, humans possess a unique burden and gift of being aware of their own existence, of questioning not just how to live, but why they live at all. This fundamental drive to understand our place in the universe distinguishes us from every other known form of life. A lion does not pause mid-hunt to contemplate the meaninglessness of the chase. A tree does not question its purpose as it reaches toward the sun. Yet humans, blessed and cursed with consciousness, cannot escape the persistent whisper of existential inquiry that accompanies our every waking moment. We are meaning-seeking creatures trapped in what often appears to be a meaning-indifferent universe, a cosmic joke that would be amusing if it weren't so profoundly unsettling, the ancient echo of modern anxiety. This search for meaning is not a recent phenomenon born of modern alienation or contemporary nihilism. From the moment humans developed the capacity for abstract thought, we have grappled with questions of purpose and significance. The ancient myths of every civilization, from Mesopotamian creation stories to Greek tragedies, from Hindu cosmologies to Aboriginal Dreamtime narratives, represent humanity's earliest attempts to construct frameworks of meaning that could contain and explain our existence. Yet something shifted dramatically in the modern era, particularly in the wake of the two world wars that devastated the first half of the 20th century. The traditional structures that had long provided answers to humanity's deepest questions, religion, nationalism, family traditions, social hierarchies, began to crack under the weight of unprecedented destruction and moral complexity. The Holocaust, the atomic bomb, mechanized warfare, and industrial-scale genocide forced thinking individuals to confront a disturbing possibility. Perhaps the universe truly is indifferent to human suffering. Perhaps there is no grand design, no inherent purpose, no cosmic justice waiting to balance the scales. This realization didn't strike humanity like a sudden lightning bolt. Instead, it seeped into consciousness like water through a broken foundation, slowly undermining the certainties that previous generations had taken for granted. The result was what we might call an existential crisis of unprecedented proportions, not just for individuals, but for entire cultures and civilizations. The modern predicament, freedom without foundation, the collapse of traditional meaning-making systems left modern humans in a peculiar position. On one hand, we found ourselves more free than any previous generation, free from the rigid constraint of predetermined social roles, religious dogma, and unquestioned authority. The Enlightenment had given us reason, science had given us power over nature, and political revolutions had given us democratic ideals. We could choose our careers, our partners, our beliefs, our lifestyles with a freedom that would have been unimaginable to our ancestors. Yet this freedom came with a price that proved steeper than anyone had anticipated. Without the guardrails of tradition and the comfort of absolute truths, individuals found themselves standing at the edge of an abyss of possibility, forced to create their own meaning in a world that offered no instruction manual for existence. The question transformed from what does God want me to do, or what does my society expect of me, to the far more daunting, what do I want to do, and why should I want anything at all? This is a central paradox of modern existence. We are simultaneously more free and more anxious than any humans who have ever lived. We can be anything, which means we must choose what to be. We can believe anything, which means we must decide what to believe. We can value anything, which means we must determine what is value. The weight of these choices, made without cosmic guidance or universal validation, can be overwhelming. Enter the philosophers of the absurd. Into this landscape of existential uncertainty step two remarkable French thinkers whose names have become synonymous with the philosophical exploration of meaning and meaninglessness: Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre. Both men lived through the crucible of World War II. Both witnessed the collapse of traditional certainties. and both dedicated their intellectual lives to confronting the fundamental question of how human beings should respond to a universe that appears indifferent to their deepest needs and highest aspirations. At first glance, these two philosophers might appear to be engaged in a kind of intellectual duel, offering competing visions of how to navigate the treacherous waters of modern existence. Camus, with his doctrine of the absurd and his image of Sisyphus eternally pushing his boulder up the mountain, seems to counsel a kind of heroic acceptance of meaninglessness. Sartre, with his emphasis on radical freedom and authentic existence, appears to advocate for a more aggressive assertion of human agency in the face of cosmic indifference. Yet to view these thinkers as opponents engaged in philosophical combat would be to fundamentally misunderstand their relationship, both to each other and to the human condition they sought to illuminate. Rather than offering contradictory solutions to the problem of existence, Camus and Sartre provide complementary approaches to the same fundamental challenge. How do we live fully and authentically in a world that offers no inherent guidance for living? Two paths through the same forest. Imagine two explorers setting out to map an uncharted wilderness. Both recognize that the territory is dangerous, that there are no reliable maps, and that conventional wisdom about navigation may prove useless in this strange new landscape. One explorer decides to focus on developing an internal compass, learning to find direction through careful attention to subtle environmental cues, and accepting that certain areas of the map may forever remain blank. The other focuses on the art of pathfinding itself, emphasizing the tools and techniques needed to create new routes through previously impassable terrain. Both explorers are engaged in the same essential project, learning to navigate unknown territory, but their approaches, skills, and areas of focus differ significantly. Neither approach is superior to the other. Indeed, the most successful expedition might well benefit from both perspectives, drawing on the internal compass when external landmarks fail, and employing pathfinding techniques when new routes must be forged. This metaphor captures something essential about the relationship between Camus and Sartre. Both philosophers recognize that the traditional maps of meaning have become unreliable, that the old landmarks of religious certainty, cultural tradition, and philosophical absolutes could no longer be trusted to guide human navigation. Both accepted that individuals would need to develop new ways of finding direction in an uncertain world. But their approaches to this challenge, while complementary, emphasize different aspects of the human response to existential uncertainty. Camus developed what we might call an internal compass for navigating absurdity, a way of maintaining orientation and purpose even when the external world provides no clear signals about direction or destination. His philosophy teaches us how to find meaning in the very struggle against meaninglessness, how to create value through the act of rebellion against an indifferent universe. Sartre, meanwhile, became a master pathfinder, developing tools and techniques for creating new routes through the wilderness of radical freedom. His existentialism provides a methodology for authentic choice-making, a framework for understanding how individual decisions create both personal identity and universal human values. The post-war crucible. To understand why these particular thinkers emerged at this particular moment in history, we must appreciate the unique historical crucible that shaped their thinking. The period following World War II was unlike any previous era in human experience. The scale of destruction, the revelation of systematic genocide, the development of weapons capable of ending human civilization, and the rapid collapse of colonial empires created a perfect storm of existential questioning. For the first time in human history, it became possible to imagine not just individual death, but the death of the entire human species. The atomic bomb represented more than a new weapon. It symbolized humanity's capacity for absolute self-destruction. Suddenly, questions about the meaning of life took on new urgency. If humans could eliminate themselves entirely, if civilization itself was fragile and perhaps temporary, then what was the point of any human endeavor? Simultaneously, the Holocaust and other genocides of the 20th century forced a reckoning with the problem of evil that traditional theodicies could not adequately address. How could benevolent God permit such systematic cruelty? How could supposedly civilized societies descend into barbarism so quickly? How could ordinary people participate in or remain indifferent to extraordinary evil? These questions created what we might call an existential emergency, a crisis of meaning so profound that it demanded not just personal response but philosophical innovation. Traditional philosophy, with its emphasis on abstract logical systems and eternal truths, seemed inadequate to address the lived experience of individuals struggling to maintain sanity and purpose in an apparently insane and purposeless world. The promise of philosophical honesty. What Camus and Sartre offer was not comfort, but honesty. They refuse to provide false consolation or easy answers to humanity's deepest questions. Instead, they propose to meet existential anxiety head-on, to look directly into the abyss of meaninglessness without flinching, and to discover what possibilities for authentic living might emerge from such unflinching confrontation. This philosophical honesty was both their greatest strength and their greatest challenge. It is always easier to offer people comforting illusions and difficult truths, easier to provide simple answers than to acknowledge the complexity of the questions. Yet both men believed that only by accepting the full weight of human freedom and responsibility could individuals hope to live authentically in the modern world. Their approaches, while different in emphasis and methodology, shared a common commitment to human dignity and agency. Neither philosopher was content to let humans remain victims of circumstance, prisoners of conditioning, or puppets of unconscious forces. Both insisted on the possibility, indeed the necessity, of conscious choice and authentic action, even in the face of cosmic indifference and existential uncertainty. As we embark on this exploration of their complementary wisdom, we do so not as passive recipients of philosophical doctrine, but as active participants in the ongoing human project of meaning creation. The questions Camus and Sartre grapple with: how should we live? What makes life worth living? How do we maintain authenticity in an inauthentic world? Are not merely academic puzzles, but lived challenges that continue to confront every thinking person in the 21st century. Their insights offer not final answers, but better questions. Not certainty, but tools for navigating uncertainty. Not meaning itself, but approaches to the endless human task of creating meaning in a world that offers none ready-made. In examining their complementary philosophies, we engage not just in intellectual exercise, but in the essential work of learning to live fully human lives in an age that makes such living both more necessary and more difficult than ever before. Part 2. The absurd condition, setting the foundation. The anatomy of the absurd. To understand the philosophical revolution that Camus and Sartre brought to 20th century thought, we must first grasp what they meant by the absurd, a concept that, despite its seemingly simple name, captures one of the most profound and unsettling aspects of human existence. The absurd is not merely the silly or the irrational. It is not the kind of absurdity we might find in a comedy sketch or a bureaucratic mishap. Rather, it represents something far more fundamental and disturbing: the collision between humanity's deepest need for meaning and purpose and the universe's apparent complete indifference to that need. Picture a person standing in the middle of a vast desert, shouting questions into the wind. Why do I exist? What is my purpose? What does it all mean? The wind carries their voice away, but returns no answer, only the sound of sand shifting in silence, stretching endlessly in all directions. This is the absurd condition in its purest form. The confrontation between human beings who cannot help but ask the deepest questions about existence, and a cosmos that seems utterly incapable of providing satisfactory answers. The absurd emerges from a threefold confrontation that defines human consciousness. First, there is a human need for unity, clarity, and rational understanding, our desperate desire to comprehend our place in the cosmic order. Second, there is the unreasonable silence of the world, which refuses to respond to our questioning with anything resembling the clear, rational explanations we crave. Third, there is a collision between these first two elements, creating a kind of philosophical friction that generates what we experience as absurdity. This is not a temporary condition that can be resolved through better science, improved philosophy, or spiritual enlightenment. The absurd is structural to human existence itself. As long as humans remain conscious beings capable of asking questions about ultimate meaning, and as long as the universe continues to withhold clear answers to those questions, the absurd will remain an inescapable aspect of the human condition. The birth of modern absurdity. While the basic components of the absurd have been present throughout human history, the particular intensity with which modern thinkers experience this condition has deep roots in the intellectual and cultural transformations of the preceding centuries. The absurd, as Camus and Sartre understood it, was not born in a vacuum, but emerged from a specific historical moment when traditional sources of meaning and comfort had been systematically undermined by intellectual and social developments. The seeds of modern absurdity were planted during the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, when thinkers like Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton began to reveal a universe that operated according to mathematical laws rather than divine purpose. The Earth was no longer the center of creation, but merely one planet among many, orbiting an ordinary star in an unremarkable galaxy. Humans, far from being the crown of creation, appear to be accidents of biological evolution on a cosmic speck of dust. The Enlightenment of the 18th century accelerated this process by subjecting traditional authorities, religious, political, and philosophical, to the harsh light of rational criticism. Thinkers like Voltaire, Hume, and Kant demonstrated that many beliefs that had been taken as self-evident truths were actually based on faith, tradition, or logical fallacies. While the Enlightenment promised that reason would provide new foundations for human knowledge and morality, it also left many traditional certainties in ruins. The 19th century witnessed the culmination of this process of intellectual demolition. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution suggested that humans were not specially created beings, but the products of random mutation and natural selection. Karl Marx argued that human beliefs and institutions were determined by material conditions rather than eternal truths. Friedrich Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God and diagnosed the coming crisis of values that would follow the collapse of religious belief. By the early 20th century, even the certainties of science and reason came under attack. Einstein's theory of relativity revealed that space and time were not absolute, but relative to the observer's frame of reference. Quantum mechanics suggested that at the most fundamental level, reality was governed by probability rather than deterministic laws. Freud demonstrated that human consciousness was largely driven by unconscious forces beyond rational control. Each of these developments contributed to what we might call the great disenchantment of the modern world, the systematic removal of magic, mystery, and transcendent meaning from human experience. The result was a universe that appeared increasingly mechanistic, purposeless, and indifferent to human concerns. Modern men and women found themselves living in a world that science could describe with ever greater precision, but that seemed empty to the very meanings and purposes that make life worth living. The intellectual climate of crisis. The specific intellectual climate that gave birth to absurdist and existentialist thought was shaped by the convergence of several philosophical traditions and historical circumstances. German idealism, particularly in the work of Hegel, had attempted to reconcile the scientific worldview with human spiritual needs by positing a rational structure underlying all of reality. However, the collapse of idealism in the later 19th century left a philosophical vacuum that subsequent thinkers struggled to fill. Phenomenology, developed by Edmund Husserl and later Martin Heidegger, shifted philosophical attention from abstract metaphysical systems to the concrete structures of human experience. This turn toward lived experience would prove crucial for both Camus and Sartre, who were less interested in constructing grand theoretical systems than in understanding how individuals actually confront the challenges of existence. The devastation of World War I shattered many remaining illusions about human progress and rational civilization. The spectacle of supposedly civilized nations using industrial technology to slaughter millions of their own young men raised profound questions about the direction of human development. How could a species capable of creating great art, literature, and philosophy also be capable of such systematic destruction? The economic collapse of the 1930s and the rise of totalitarian regimes further undermined faith in human institutions and rational progress. The spectacle of millions of people willingly surrendering their freedom to charismatic leaders who promised simple solutions to complex problems revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature and social organization. World War II, with its unprecedented scale of destruction and the revelation of systematic genocide, represented the culmination of this crisis of meaning. The Holocaust, in particular, forced thinking individuals to confront the possibility that evil was not merely the absence of good, but an active force in human affairs. Traditional theodicies, attempts to reconcile the existence of evil with belief in a benevolent God, seemed inadequate to address the systematic murder of millions of innocent people. The shared diagnosis. Into this historical moment stepped Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, two thinkers who, despite their eventual philosophical and political differences, began from remarkably similar diagnoses of the human condition. Both men had lived through the crisis years of the 1930s and 1940s. Both had witnessed the collapse of traditional certainties, and both were determined to think honestly about what remained when the comfortable illusions of previous generations had been stripped away. Their shared starting point was a recognition that the universe, as revealed by modern science and confirmed by modern history, provides no inherent meaning or purpose for human existence. This was not a conclusion they reached reluctantly or with secret hope that it might be overturned by future discoveries. Rather, it was a premise they accepted fully and from which they were determined to think forward rather than backward. Both philosophers rejected what they saw as a fundamental dishonesty of traditional philosophy and religion, the tendency to begin with human needs and desires and then construct metaphysical systems that would satisfy those needs. Instead of asking what kind of universe would make us feel comfortable and significant, they asked, what kind of universe do we actually inhabit, and how should we respond to it honestly? This commitment to intellectual honesty led both men to similar conclusions about the basic structure of human existence. Humans find themselves thrown into existence without their consent, in a world they did not choose, subject to conditions they cannot control. There is no predetermined essence or nature that dictates what humans should become. There is no cosmic plan that assigns meaning and purpose to human life. There is no guarantee that individual or collective human endeavors will ultimately prove worthwhile. Yet both philosophers insisted that this recognition of fundamental meaninglessness should not lead to despair, paralysis, or nihilistic destruction. Instead, they argue that honest acceptance of the absurd condition can become a foundation for a new kind of authentic human existence, one based not on illusions about cosmic purpose, but on clear-eyed recognition of human freedom and responsibility, confronting the void. The void that both Camus and Sartre asked their readers to confront was not merely the absence of God or the breakdown of traditional values. It was something more radical and unsettling, the absence of any external validation for human choices, values, and aspirations. In pre-modern societies, individuals might derive meaning from their roles in a cosmic order that was believed to be both rational and purposeful. Even in the early modern period, many thinkers maintained faith that human reason could discover universal moral principles that would provide objective guidance for living. But the absurdist and existentialist diagnosis went deeper than the mere absence of religious or rational foundations for morality. It suggested that the very human demand for such foundations was itself problematic, a kind of intellectual and emotional immaturity that prevented people from accepting the full weight of their freedom and responsibility. The void, in this understanding, is not something to be filled but something to be inhabited. It represents not a problem to be solved but a condition to be lived. The traditional philosophical project of finding secure foundations for human knowledge and morality is abandoned not because it is difficult, but because it is unnecessary and even counterproductive. This does not mean that Camus and Sartre advocated for moral relativism or nihilistic indifference. Rather, they argued that authentic values and meanings must be created by humans themselves, through their choices and actions, without the false comfort of external validation. The absence of predetermined meaning becomes not a cause for despair, but an occasion for radical freedom and creative responsibility. The silence of the world. Central to both philosophers' understanding of the absurd is the recognition of what Camus called the silence of the world. This silence is not merely the absence of verbal communication between humans and the cosmos. It is the absence of any kind of meaningful response to human questioning. The world continues to function according to its own laws, physical, chemical, biological. But these laws do not provide answers to the questions that matter most to conscious beings. Why do we suffer? Why do we die? Why do some people experience joy while others endure misery? What is the point of human striving and achievement? The world offers no response to these questions, not because it is hostile to human concerns, but because it is simply indifferent to them. Mountains do not care whether we find them beautiful. Diseases do not consider whether their victims deserve to suffer. Natural disasters do not consult moral principles before striking. This silence is perhaps more disturbing than outright hostility would be. If the universe were actively opposed to human flourishing, we might at least feel that our existence mattered enough to provoke cosmic antagonism. But the universe's indifference suggests something more unsettling, that from the perspective of ultimate reality, human joys and sorrows, triumphs and tragedies are simply irrelevant. Yet both Camus and Sartre found in this very irrelevance a kind of liberation. If the universe does not care about human choices, then humans are free to make those choices according to their own values and aspirations. If there is no cosmic plan to which human life must conform, then humans are free to create their own plans and purposes. The silence of the world, rather than negating human agency, actually makes genuine human agency possible for the first time, beyond traditional comfort. The philosophical revolution represented by absurdist and existentialist thought required its adherents to give up not only specific religious or metaphysical beliefs, but also the emotional and intellectual comfort that such beliefs provided. Traditional philosophy had often functioned as a kind of conceptual security blanket, offering systematic explanations that could contain and domesticate the mystery and anxiety of existence. Both Camus and Sartre insisted that such comfort, however psychologically appealing, was ultimately infantilizing and destructive of authentic human development. Like parents who refuse to continue telling comforting lies to their maturing children, these philosophers demanded that their readers confront reality without the mediation of wishful thinking. This did not mean that they advocated for a kind of grim stoicism or emotional numbness. Rather, they argued that only by accepting the full weight of uncertainty and responsibility could individuals hope to experience genuine freedom, authentic relationships, and meaningful achievement. The comfort provided by traditional beliefs was revealed to be false comfort, a kind of spiritual narcotic that prevented people from fully engaging with the challenges and opportunities of actual existence. The foundation they established was therefore not a new set of comforting certainties, but a new kind of relationship to uncertainty itself. Instead of seeking to eliminate the anxiety and ambiguity that characterize human existence, they proposed to embrace these conditions as the very prerequisites for authentic living. The absurd condition, rather than being a problem to be solved, becomes the stage on which the drama of genuine human existence can unfold. This shared foundation, the honest recognition of cosmic meaninglessness combined with the insistence on human freedom and responsibility, provided a common ground for which both Camus and Sartre developed their distinctive approaches to the challenge of authentic existence. While their specific recommendations would differ significantly, both began from the same courageous acknowledgement of the absurd condition as the inescapable starting point for any honest philosophy of human life. Part 3. Albert Camus, the Absurd Hero. The making of a philosopher of the absurd. Albert Camus did not arrive at his philosophy of the absurd through abstract reasoning or academic study alone. His understanding of the fundamental tension between human longing and cosmic indifference was forged in the crucible of personal experience, shaped by the particular circumstances of his life that made him acutely sensitive to both the beauty and the cruelty of existence. To understand Camus the philosopher, we must first understand Camus the man, a figure whose biography reads like a meditation on the very themes that would define his intellectual legacy. Born in 1913 in the working-class district of Mondovi, Algeria, Camus entered the world already marked by loss and struggle. His father, Lucien, was killed at the Battle of the Marne in 1914, when Albert was barely a year old. This early encounter with meaningless death, his father dying in a war that seemed to accomplish little beyond massive slaughter, would prove prophetic of Camus' later preoccupation with the arbitrary nature of human suffering. Raised by his illiterate mother, Catherine, and his tyrannical grandmother in the impoverished Belcourt district of Algiers, Camus grew up in a world where intellectual aspirations seemed almost impossibly distant. His mother, partially deaf and emotionally remote, worked as a cleaning woman to support the family. The young Camus learned early that life offered no guarantees of comfort, security, or even basic communication between human beings. Yet these harsh circumstances also provided him with something invaluable, an unromanticized view of human existence that would later inform his unflinching examination of the human condition. The landscape of Algeria itself played a crucial role in shaping Camus' philosophical sensibility. The overwhelming beauty of the Mediterranean coastline, with its intense light and azure waters, stood in stark contrast to the social injustices and colonial tensions that marked North African society. This juxtaposition of natural splendor and human suffering would become a recurring theme in his work. The recognition that the world's beauty makes its indifference to human concerns all the more poignant and disturbing. The body's rebellion. At 17, just as Camus was beginning to discover his intellectual gifts and athletic talents, tuberculosis struck with devastating force. The disease, which would shadow him for the rest of his life, was more than a medical condition. It became an existential teacher of the harshest kind. Tuberculosis in the 1930s was often a death sentence, particularly for someone of Camus' modest economic circumstances. The disease forced him to confront his own mortality at an age when most young people feel invincible. The experience of serious illness taught Camus several lessons that would prove central to philosophy. First, it demonstrated the fundamental fragility of human existence, how quickly health, plans, and dreams could be destroyed by a biological accident. Second, it revealed the arbitrary nature of suffering. Camus had done nothing to deserve his illness, just as others had done nothing to deserve their health. Third, it showed him how illness could isolate individuals from the normal flow of social life, creating a kind of existential solitude that forced deeper questions about the meaning and value of existence. Perhaps most importantly, tuberculosis gave Camus an intimate knowledge of what he would later call the absurd long before he developed the philosophical vocabulary to describe it. Here was his rational mind, making plans and setting goals, confronted by a diseased body that rendered those plans meaningless. Here was his desire to live fully and passionately, constrained by a condition that threatened to cut short his life at any moment. The disease embodied the collision between human aspiration and biological limitation that lies at the heart of the absurd condition. Yet Camus' response to illness was not despair, but a kind of intensified appreciation for life's experiences. Unable to take health for granted, he learned to savor moments of physical well-being with unusual intensity. Barred from competitive sports, he turned to writing and intellectual pursuits with passionate dedication. The shadow of mortality, rather than paralyzing him, seemed to sharpen his appreciation for beauty, friendship, and creative expression. The School of War. The Second World War provided Camus with another formative encounter with the absurd, this time on a collective rather than personal scale. Initially rejected from military service due to his tuberculosis, Camus found himself observing the early years of the conflict from the sidelines. However, as the war progressed and the French resistance began to organize, he gradually became involved in underground activities, eventually becoming editor of the clandestine newspaper Combat. The resistance years were crucial to Camus' intellectual development because they forced him to confront the practical implications of his emerging philosophy. It was one thing to contemplate the absurd condition in the abstract. It was quite another to decide how to act when faced with concrete moral choices in the context of occupation, collaboration, and resistance. The experience of living under Nazi occupation revealed new dimensions of absurdity. Here was a supposedly rational civilization that had produced some of humanity's greatest achievements in art, science, and philosophy, yet it also created a regime dedicated to systematic murder and oppression. The very people who had given the world Goethe and Beethoven were now implementing policies of genocidal brutality. How could human beings be simultaneously capable of such beauty and such horror? Working for the resistance also taught Camus about the moral complexities that arise when abstract principles meet concrete circumstances. The resistance engaged in activities, sabotage, assassination, deception, that would be clearly immoral in peacetime, but seemed necessary given the extreme circumstances of occupation. This experience would later inform his skepticism about political ideologies that claim to provide clear, universal answers to moral questions. Most importantly, the war years demonstrated to Camus that the recognition of life's absurdity need not lead to moral paralysis or nihilistic indifference. Even if the universe provided no ultimate justification for choosing resistance over collaboration, individuals could still make authentic choices based on their own values and commitments. The absence of cosmic meaning did not eliminate the possibility of human meaning created through action and solidarity. The architecture of the absurd from these biographical experiences, childhood poverty, serious illness, wartime resistance, Camus developed his distinctive understanding of the absurd as a fundamental structure of human existence. Unlike philosophers who arrived at their conclusions through purely theoretical reasoning, Camus built his philosophy on the foundation of lived experience, creating what he called an ethics and an aesthetic of existence. For Camus, the absurd is not primarily an intellectual concept, but an experiential reality, something that individuals encounter directly in moment of clarity when the usual justifications for living suddenly seem inadequate or meaningless. He described these moments of absurd illumination with particular vividness. The feeling of strangeness that can overcome us when looking at a familiar landscape, the sense of alienation that can arise in the middle of routine activities, the vertigo that accompanies the recognition of our own mortality. The absurd, in Camus' understanding, emerges from the confrontation between two fundamental aspects of human existence. On one side stands human rationality, our need to understand, to find patterns, to discover meaning and purpose in our experiences. This rationality is not merely intellectual, but deeply emotional. We don't just want to understand the world. We need to understand it in order to feel at home in our existence. On the other side stands the world's irrationality. Its refusal to conform to our rational expectations, its indifference to our need for meaning, its tendency to operate according to principles that have nothing to do with human values or aspirations. This irrationality is not the same as chaos. The world operates according to discoverable laws, but these laws are morally neutral and provide no guidance for human living. The absurd is neither the human demand for meaning nor the world's silence taken separately, but rather the tension that arises when these two elements are brought together in consciousness. It is a lived experience of being a meaning-seeking creature in a meaning-indifferent universe, a condition that cannot be resolved through better science, improved philosophy, or spiritual enlightenment, because it is structural to human existence itself. The three pathways. Camus identified three possible responses to the recognition of life's absurdity, each representing a different way of dealing with the tension between human needs and cosmic indifference. These responses are not merely theoretical options, but lived possibilities that individuals actually choose, often unconsciously, in their day-to-day existence. The first response is despair, the overwhelming sense that if life has no ultimate meaning or purpose, then nothing we do really matters. This response often manifests as depression, cynicism, or a kind of emotional numbness that protects individuals from feeling the full weight of their situation. Those who choose despair may continue to go through the motions of living, but they do so without genuine engagement or hope. Despair, in Camus' analysis, is understandable but ultimately inauthentic because it represents a kind of surrender to the absurd condition rather than a genuine response to it. It accepts the premise that life is meaningless, but draws the conclusion that this meaninglessness makes action and engagement impossible. In doing so, it fails to recognize that the absence of ultimate meaning does not negate the possibility of proximate meaning, created through human choice and commitment. The second response is suicide, the decision to escape the absurd condition entirely by ending one's existence. Camus treated suicide not merely as a personal tragedy, but as a philosophical problem of the highest importance. If life is indeed absurd, if human existence serves no ultimate purpose and is destined to end in death anyway, then why not cut short the process and spare oneself further suffering? This question led Camus to make his most famous philosophical declaration. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. This statement, which opens the myth of Sisyphus, was not meant to encourage suicidal thoughts, but to highlight the existential urgency that should inform all genuine philosophical inquiry. For Camus, the question of suicide forces us to confront the most basic issue of human existence. Given that we will die anyway, and given that our lives may have no ultimate significance, what reason do we have to continue living? Any philosophy that cannot provide a compelling answer to this question, he argued, is not worthy of serious consideration. The third response, which Camus advocated as the most authentic and courageous, is acceptance, not passive resignation to the absurd condition, but active embrace of it as a foundation for a new kind of human existence. This acceptance does not deny or minimize the reality of the absurd, but rather acknowledges it fully while refusing to be defeated by it. Acceptance, in Camus' understanding, involves a kind of philosophical rebellion, not against specific political or social conditions, but against the absurd itself. This rebellion does not seek to overcome or transcend the absurd, which would be impossible, but rather to live fully and authentically within its constraints. It represents a refusal to be diminished by meaninglessness, an insistence on creating human value and significance even in the absence of cosmic validation. The philosophical wager. Camus' choice of acceptance over despair or suicide can be understood as a kind of philosophical wager, similar to Pascal's famous wager about the existence of God. However, where Pascal argued that we should believe in God because the potential benefits of belief outweigh the costs even if God doesn't exist, Camus argued that we should choose life and engagement because the alternative, surrender to meaninglessness, is even more absurd than the absurd condition itself. The logic of Camus' wager runs something like this. If life is absurd, then suicide is not a solution, but merely another expression of the absurd. To kill oneself because life is meaningless is to allow meaninglessness to have the final word, to grant ultimate power to the very condition one is trying to escape. It is, in a sense, to be defeated by an opponent that doesn't even know it's fighting. Furthermore, suicide eliminates the possibility of whatever meaning and value might be created through human action and consciousness. Even if this meaning is not ultimate or eternal, it is still real as a human creation. To destroy consciousness because it cannot find ultimate validation is to destroy the only source of meaning that actually exists in our experience. Most importantly, choosing life in full recognition of its absurdity represents a kind of heroic defiance that has its own intrinsic value. It demonstrates human capacity to create meaning and maintain dignity even under the most difficult circumstances. It shows that consciousness, rather than being cursed by the ability to recognize absurdity, can transform that recognition into a source of freedom and authenticity. This wager on life and consciousness, made without guarantee of ultimate justification, became the foundation for everything else in Camus' philosophy. It represents not an escape from the absurd, but a way of inhabiting it that preserves human dignity and opens up possibilities for genuine living. The absurd hero is born at the moment when an individual makes this wager, choosing to live fully not despite the absurd condition, but because of the opportunities for authentic existence that it creates. Camus' journey from the poverty of colonial Algeria through illness and war to philosophical recognition illustrates how the most profound insights often emerge not from abstract theorizing, but from the honest confrontation with life's most challenging experiences. His philosophy of the absurd, rather than being a product of academic speculation, represents the distillation of a life lived in constant awareness of both beauty and tragedy, meaning and meaninglessness, hope and despair. In choosing acceptance over the alternatives, Camus offered not just a philosophical position, but a way of being human that acknowledges the full complexity of our condition while refusing to be defeated by it. Part 4. Camus' response, revolt, creation, and passion. The absurd man's revolution. Having chosen acceptance over despair or suicide, Camus faced a crucial question. How should one live in full recognition of life's absurdity? His answer was not a retreat into nihilistic indifference or stoical detachment, but rather a passionate engagement with existence that he characterized through 3 interconnected responses: revolt, creation, and passion. These were not philosophical abstractions, but practical attitudes that could transform the recognition of meaninglessness into a foundation for authentic living. The absurd man. Camus' term for the individual who has fully grasped and accepted the absurd condition does not seek to escape or transcend a situation, but rather to inhabit it with maximum intensity and integrity. This figure represents a new kind of human being, one who has abandoned the traditional quest for ultimate meaning, while discovering new possibilities for immediate meaning created through conscious choice and deliberate action. Camus' absurd man is neither a pessimist nor an optimist in any conventional sense. He does not expect the universe to validate his choices or provide cosmic significance to his actions. Yet neither does he withdraw from engagement with the world or surrender to despair about the human condition. Instead, he discovers that the very recognition of absurdity can become a source of liberation, freeing him from the need for external validation and opening up new possibilities for self-creation and authentic relationships with others. This liberation is not without its challenges. The absurd man must learn to live without the comforting certainties that have traditionally guided human behavior. He cannot appeal to divine commands, natural laws, or rational principles to justify his choices. Yet this absence of predetermined guidelines also means that he is free to create his own values and purposes through the very act of living. The absence of ultimate meaning becomes not a prison, but a blank canvas on which the absurd man can paint his own vision of what human existence might become. Revolt, the refusal to surrender. The first and perhaps most fundamental response to the absurd condition is what Camus called revolt. But this is not the kind of political or social rebellion that seeks to overthrow existing institutions and replace them with better ones. Rather, it is a more basic form of refusal, the determination not to surrender to the absurd, not to be diminished or defeated by the recognition of meaninglessness. Revolt, in Camus' understanding, is first and foremost a mental attitude, a way of positioning oneself in relation to the absurd condition that preserves human dignity and agency even in the face of cosmic indifference. It involves saying no to despair, no to the temptation of false consolations, and no to any philosophy or ideology that would demand the sacrifice of individual consciousness to some supposed higher purpose. This revolt is paradoxical because it does not seek to overcome the absurd. Camus insisted that the absurd cannot be resolved or transcended, but rather to live in constant tension with it. The absurd man revolts not because he believes his revolt will succeed in any ultimate sense, but because the act of revolt itself expresses something essential about human nature. We are beings who cannot help but assert our values and pursue our goals, even when we know that these values and goals have no cosmic validation. The revolt against the absurd is simultaneously a revolt in favor of human consciousness and human experience. By refusing to be defeated by meaninglessness, the absurd man affirms the value of awareness itself, the strange and wonderful fact that the universe has produced beings capable of questioning their own existence. This consciousness may be fragile, temporary, and ultimately doomed, but it is also precious precisely because of its rarity and vulnerability. Camus distinguished his notion of revolt from both resignation and revolution. Resignation accepts the absurd condition, but draws the conclusion that nothing can be done about it, leading to passivity and withdrawal from engagement. Revolution, on the other hand, refuses to accept the absurd and seeks to create new systems of meaning that will eliminate the tension between human needs and cosmic reality. Both responses, in Camus' view, represent failures to understand the true nature of the human situation. True revolt maintains attention without seeking to resolve it. It acknowledges that the universe is indifferent to human concerns while refusing to become indifferent to human concerns itself. It recognizes that individual actions may have no ultimate significance while insisting on the immediate significance of those actions for the individuals who perform them and the communities they affect. This form of revolt requires a kind of intellectual honesty that most people find difficult to maintain. It demands that we act passionately and commit ourselves fully to our choices, while simultaneously acknowledging that these choices have no foundation beyond our own decision to make them. It calls for what Camus described as lucid thinking combined with passionate engagement, a rare combination that requires both intellectual courage and emotional resilience. Creation, or as defiance. The second response to the absurd condition is creation, particularly artistic creation, which Camus viewed as perhaps the most authentic and powerful form of revolt available to human beings. Art, in all its forms, represents humanity's attempt to impose form, beauty, and meaning on raw experience, to transform the chaos and indifference of existence into something that speaks to human values and aspirations. For Camus, the act of artistic creation was inherently absurd in the best possible sense. The artist knows that their work will not change the fundamental structure of reality, will not eliminate suffering or death, will not provide ultimate answers to existential questions. Yet they create anyway, driven by an irrepressible need to express their vision of what human existence might be at its most beautiful, truthful, or meaningful. This paradox, creating meaning while knowing it to be ultimately groundless, exemplifies the absurd man's approach to all of life's activities. The artist becomes a model for how to live authentically in an absurd world, with full commitment to one's chosen activities, combined with clear-eyed recognition of their ultimate limitations. Camus was particularly drawn to the visual arts and literature as examples of how human beings can respond creatively to the absurd condition. A painting captures a moment of beauty or insight that would otherwise be lost to time. A novel creates characters and situations that illuminate aspects of human experience that might otherwise go unnoticed. A poem distills complex emotions into language that can be shared across cultures and generations. Yet the value of these artistic creations does not depend on their permanence or their ability to solve fundamental problems. Even if every painting will eventually fade, every book will eventually crumble, and every poem will eventually be forgotten, the act of creation itself has immediate value for both the creator and those who encounter the work. Art creates temporary islands of meaning in an ocean of meaninglessness, islands that may be swept away by time but that provide genuine human experiences while they exist. The creative response to absurdity also extends beyond the traditionally recognized arts to include any activity through which individuals express their unique vision of what human life might become. A teacher who dedicates themselves to helping students discover their own capacity for thought and feeling. A doctor who commits to alleviating suffering even though death is ultimately inevitable. A parent who nurtures a child's development knowing that the child will face the same existential challenges that all humans face. All of these can be understood as forms of creative response to the absurd condition. What unites all genuine forms of creation is their character as acts of affirmation performed without external justification. The creator does not create because they have been commanded to do so by God, or because nature requires it, or because reason demands it. They create because creation itself expresses something essential about what it means to be human. Our capacity to bring into existence something that was not there before, something that embodies our values and our vision of possibility. This creative capacity becomes, in Camus' philosophy, one of the primary sources of human dignity and significance. Even if we cannot find meaning in the universe, we can create meaning through our own activities. Even if we cannot discover ultimate purposes, we can invent proximate purposes that give structure and direction to our lives. The act of creation becomes a form of rebellion against the meaninglessness of existence. Not a rebellion that seeks to overthrow meaninglessness, but one that refuses to be diminished by it. Passion, the intensity of immediate experience. The third component of the absurd man's response is passion, the commitment to experiencing life with maximum intensity and fullness, savoring each moment and relationship for its own sake, rather than as a means to some future end. This passion is not the romantic emotion of the same name, but rather a comprehensive attitude toward experience that seeks to extract from each moment whatever richness and significance it might contain. Camus' emphasis on passion reflects his conviction that if life has no ultimate meaning, then its immediate meanings become all the more precious and deserving of attention. Since we cannot know what lies beyond death, and since we cannot count on any transcendent purpose to validate our existence, the experiences we have while living become our only certain sources of value and significance. This passionate engagement with immediate experience requires a fundamental shift in how we think about the relationship between present and future. Traditional approaches to life often treat the present as valuable primarily insofar as it contributes to some future goal: salvation, success, happiness, knowledge, or social progress. But the absurd man cannot rely on any of these future-oriented justifications because he recognizes that all human projects are ultimately temporary and groundless. Instead, he learns to find value in experiences themselves, independent of their consequences or their contribution to larger purposes. A conversation with a friend becomes valuable not because it advances some social or professional goal, but because of the immediate pleasure, connection, and understanding. A walk through a beautiful landscape becomes significant not as a means to health or spiritual enlightenment, but as an occasion for aesthetic appreciation and sensory engagement. This does not mean that the absurd man becomes a hedonist who seeks only immediate pleasure, nor does it mean that he abandons all planning and future-oriented thinking. Rather, he develops what we might call a double consciousness, the ability to engage fully with immediate experiences while maintaining awareness that these experiences are temporary and that their value depends on his own investment of attention and care rather than on any objective significance they might possess. The passion that Camus advocated is closely related to what he observed in the Mediterranean culture of his youth, a way of living that emphasized direct engagement with sensory experience, emotional expression, and social connection. He contrasted this with what he saw as the more abstract, future-oriented, and guilt-ridden approaches to life that characterized much of Northern European culture. Yet Camus' passion is not naive or unreflective. It is informed by full awareness of mortality, suffering, and the ultimate transience of all human experiences. This awareness does not diminish passion, but rather intensifies it, creating what he described as a desperate quality. Not desperate in the sense of hopeless, but desperate in the sense of urgent and fully committed. The passionate response to absurdity also involves a commitment to honesty about one's own experiences and emotions. The absurd man does not pretend to feel more or less than he actually feels, does not deny difficult emotions in favor of false optimism, and does not suppress genuine enthusiasms out of fear that they might appear foolish or naive. He learns to trust his own experiential responses as the only reliable guide to value in a world that provides no external measures of significance. Sisyphus, the ultimate symbol. All three responses, revolt, creation, and passion, come together in Camus' famous interpretation of the myth of Sisyphus, which serves as a central metaphor for his entire philosophy of the absurd. According to Greek mythology, Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to spend eternity pushing a massive boulder to the top of a mountain, only to watch it roll back down, forcing him to begin the task again. This punishment was considered the most dreadful because it combined futile labor with the consciousness of that futility. For most interpretations, Sisyphus represents the ultimate image of meaningless suffering, endless, repetitive work that accomplishes nothing and serves no purpose. But Camus saw in this figure something quite different, the perfect emblem of the human condition and the possibility of authentic response to that condition. Sisyphus becomes not a symbol of despair, but a model of heroic acceptance and even joy in the face of absurdity. Camus' interpretation hinges on a crucial moment in the myth that is often overlooked: the walk back down the mountain after the boulder has rolled to the bottom. During this brief interval, Sisyphus is free from his labor and can contemplate his situation. It is in this moment, Camus suggests, that Sisyphus becomes conscious of his condition, and it is this consciousness that transforms him from a victim into a hero. The consciousness that Sisyphus achieves during his walk down the mountain is precisely the awareness of the absurd that Camus advocated for all human beings. Sisyphus recognizes that his task is meaningless, that it will never be completed, that the gods have condemned him to eternal futility. Yet rather than being crushed by this recognition, he is liberated by it. Once he fully understands the situation, he is no longer subject to false hopes or illusions. He can no longer expect his work to lead to some ultimate accomplishment or redemption. This liberation through consciousness allows Sisyphus to relate to his task in a completely new way. Instead of pushing the boulder in the vain hope that this time it might stay at the top, he can push it knowing exactly what will happen and choosing to do so anyway. His labor becomes not a desperate attempt to achieve the impossible, but a deliberate expression of his own will and character. In this transformation, all three of Camus' responses to the absurd become manifest. Sisyphus revolts against his punishment not by refusing to push the boulder, which would accomplish nothing, but by refusing to be spiritually defeated by the meaninglessness of the task. He creates meaning through the very style and manner of his labor, transforming routine drudgery into an expression of human dignity and defiance. And he experiences passion through full engagement with his immediate situation, finding in the physical effort, the mountain landscape, and even his own suffering a richness of experience that no god can take away from him. The genius of Camus' interpretation lies in his famous conclusion: the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. This happiness is not the conventional contentment that comes from achieving one's goals or receiving external validation. It is the deeper satisfaction that comes from living authentically, from perfect alignment between one's consciousness, one's choices, and one's actions. Sisyphus is happy not despite his punishment, but because of what his consciousness has made of that punishment. He has found a way to live fully even under the most constrained circumstances, to create meaning even in the most apparently meaningless situation, to experience passion even in the context of eternal repetition. He becomes the ultimate absurd hero because he demonstrates that authentic existence is possible under any conditions, no matter how difficult or apparently hopeless. This image of Sisyphus serves as both a challenge and an inspiration for anyone seeking to live authentically in the modern world. Like Sisyphus, we find ourselves engaged in activities that may have no ultimate significance, careers that will be forgotten, relationships that will end in separation or death, creative projects that will eventually be lost to time. Yet, like Sisyphus, we have the possibility of transforming these activities through consciousness, revolt, creation, and passion into expressions of authentic human existence. The myth suggests a happiness, understood not as pleasure or satisfaction, but as full engagement with one's actual situation, is available to anyone who can achieve the kind of lucid consciousness that Sisyphus represents. This happiness requires no external validation, no ultimate meaning, no guarantee of permanence. It requires only the courage to see clearly, the determination to resist despair, and the passion to engage fully with whatever life presents. In this way, every human being has the potential to become their own version of Sisyphus, pushing their own boulder, walking their own path down the mountain, and discovering their own possibilities for authentic existence within the constraints of the absurd condition. Part 5. Jean-Paul Sartre, Existence Precedes Essence. The Making of an Existentialist. Where Albert Camus emerged from the sun-baked landscapes of colonial Algeria with an intuitive understanding of life's absurdity, Jean-Paul Sartre arrived at his existentialist insights through a more cerebral route, one that led him to the corridors of elite Parisian academia and into the depths of German phenomenology before depositing him at the heart of wartime resistance and post-war intellectual celebrity. Yet despite these differences in background and temperament, Sartre would develop a philosophy that, while distinct from Camus' absurdism, addressed many of the same fundamental questions about human existence, freedom, and meaning in the modern world. Born in 1905 into the Parisian bourgeoisie, Sartre experienced a childhood marked not by material deprivation, but by psychological complexity. His father, Jean-Baptiste Sartre, died when Jean-Paul was barely 2 years old, leaving him to be raised by his mother Anne-Marie and his domineering grandfather, Charles Schweitzer, uncle of the famous Albert Schweitzer. This early loss of paternal authority would later inform Sartre's lifelong suspicion of all forms of external authority and his insistence on radical individual freedom. The young Sartre was intellectually precocious but physically unremarkable, short, cross-eyed, and often mocked by his peers. These early experiences of social alienation may have contributed to his later fascination with the dynamics of human relationships and the ways in which individuals struggle to define themselves in relation to others. Unlike Camus, who found solace in the physical beauty of the Mediterranean world, Sartre seemed more at home in the realm of ideas, where physical limitations could be transcended through intellectual prowess. His education at the École Normale Supérieure, France's most prestigious institution for training intellectuals, immersed him in the French philosophical tradition while also exposing him to German phenomenology, particularly the work of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. This encounter with phenomenology, the philosophical method that focuses on structures of experience and consciousness, would prove decisive for Sartre's intellectual development, the phenomenological revolution. Phenomenology offered Sartre something that traditional French philosophy had largely lacked, a method for examining consciousness and experience without falling into either naive realism, the assumption that we can know things as they really are, or idealistic subjectivism, the assumption that everything is merely a product of mind. Husserl's famous slogan, "To the things themselves," suggested that philosophy should focus on phenomena as they appear to consciousness, without making assumptions about what might lie behind or beyond those appearances. For Sartre, this phenomenological approach opened up new possibilities for understanding human existence. Rather than beginning with abstract metaphysical principles or trying to deduce the nature of human being from some general theory about reality, phenomenology suggested that philosophy should start with concrete human experiences and examine their structures carefully and systematically. Heidegger's influence was even more profound and lasting. From Heidegger, Sartre absorbed the insight that human existence, Dasein, is fundamentally different from the existence of mere things. While objects in the world simply are what they are, human beings exist in a mode of constant questioning and self-interpretation. We don't just exist. We exist in such a way that our existence is always an issue for us. We are, in Heidegger's terminology, beings for whom being is a question. However, Sartre was deeply troubled by what he saw as Heidegger's mystical tendencies and his apparent embrace of a kind of philosophical nationalism that would later manifest in his brief association with Nazism. Sartre wanted to preserve Heidegger's insights about human existence while stripping away what he regarded as unnecessary metaphysical baggage and political danger. The result was Sartre's distinctive version of existentialism, a philosophy that combined phenomenological rigor with radical atheism, German insights about the nature of human existence with French clarity and systematic thinking, and abstract philosophical analysis with concrete political engagement. The revolutionary formula. Sartre's most famous philosophical formula, existence precedes essence, represents both a radical departure from traditional philosophical thinking and a crystallization of insights that have been developing in European thought since at least the 19th century. To understand the revolutionary nature of this formula, we must first understand what it rejects. Throughout the history of Western philosophy, most thinkers had assumed that essence precedes existence, that things have essential natures that determine what they are and how they should behave. A knife has the essence of being a cutting tool, which explains its design and determines its proper use. A tree has the essence of being a living organism that grows toward the sun and reproduces itself. Even human beings, in this additional view, have essential natures, rational animal, child of God, social being, that determine their fundamental characteristics and obligations. This essentialist approach had profound implications for ethics and politics. If humans have a fixed essential nature, then moral and political philosophy becomes a matter of discovering what that nature requires and organizing society accordingly. Natural law theorists argued that we could derive moral obligations from human essence. Religious thinkers claimed that God had created humans with specific purposes that we are obligated to fulfill. Even secular philosophers like Aristotle maintained that human flourishing, eudaimonia, could be understood by examining the essential function or purpose of human beings. Sartre's formula turns this entire tradition on its head. For human beings, he argued, existence precedes essence. We exist first. We find ourselves thrown into existence without our consent, and only then do we create whatever essence or nature we might have through our choices and actions. There is no predetermined human nature, no essential purpose that we are obligated to fulfill, no divine plan or natural law that dictates how we should live. This reversal has staggering implications. If human beings have no essential nature, then we are radically free to create ourselves through our choices. We are not constrained by biological instincts as animals are, divine commands as traditional religion claimed, or rational principles as Enlightenment philosophy suggested. We are, in Sartre's famous phrase, condemned to be free, forced to choose what we will become without any external guidance about what we should choose. The formula applies only to human beings because only humans exist in the mode of consciousness and self-awareness that makes self-creation possible. A paper cutter, to use Sartre's famous example, has its essence, cutting paper, precede its existence because it is created by a craftsman who has a specific purpose in mind. The craftsman conceives of the paper cutter's essence before bringing it into existence. But human beings, in Sartre's atheistic universe, have no creator who conceived of their purpose before bringing them into existence. We simply find ourselves existing, and then must decide what to make of our existence. The burden of radical freedom, the freedom that follows from existence precedes essence, is not the comfortable liberty that political philosophers celebrate, the freedom to pursue our interests within reasonable limits. It is what Sartre called radical freedom, the terrifying and inescapable responsibility to choose not only our actions, but our very selves, our values, and our understanding of what human existence should become. This freedom is radical in several senses. First, it is complete. There are no external authorities that can legitimately tell us how to live. God, nature, reason, tradition, and social convention may all influence our choices, but none of them can determine those choices. We are always free to reject any external guidance and choose our own path. Second, this freedom is inescapable. We cannot choose not to choose. Even the decision to let others make our decisions for us is itself a choice. We cannot appeal to our past, our unconscious, our emotions, or our circumstances to excuse ourselves from the responsibility of choosing. Whatever factors may influence our decisions, the final choice is always ours. Third, this freedom extends beyond our actions to our very being. We don't just choose what to do, we choose who to be. Every choice we make contributes to creating our character, our values, and our understanding of what human existence means. In choosing for ourselves, we are also choosing for all humanity, because our choices express our vision of what human beings should become. This last point reveals one of the most unsettling aspects of Sartre's philosophy. When we choose, we are not just selecting one option among many for our private benefit. We are making a statement about what we believe human existence should be. If I choose to be honest, I am implicitly claiming that honesty is a value that all humans should embrace. If I choose to be selfish, I am suggesting that selfishness is an acceptable way for humans to relate to each other. The weight of this responsibility is enormous. Every choice becomes a kind of moral legislation for the entire human species. Every action carries the burden of representing not just what I want to do, but what I think any human being in my situation should do. This is what Sartre meant when he said that in choosing ourselves, we choose all humanity. The escape of bad faith. Given the enormous weight of radical freedom and responsibility, it is not surprising that most people, most of the time, try to escape from or deny their freedom. Sartre called this escape bad faith, mauvaise foi. The attempt to convince ourselves that we are not free, that our choices are determined by factors beyond our control, that we are things rather than conscious beings capable of self-creation. Bad faith takes many forms, but all involve some version of the same fundamental denial, the refusal to acknowledge our radical freedom and the responsibility that goes with it. Sometimes we pretend that our choices are determined by our past, our upbringing, or our psychological makeup. I can't help being angry. That's just the way I am. Sometimes we claim that external circumstances leave us no choice. I had to lie to protect my job. Sometimes we appeal to social roles or expectations to avoid taking responsibility for our decisions. I'm just doing what any mother would do. Sartre's most famous example of bad faith is the cafe waiter, who plays at being a waiter so completely that he seems to have convinced himself that waiting tables is his essential nature rather than a role he has chosen to play. The waiter moves with exaggerated precision, anticipates customers' needs with theatrical attentiveness, and seems to embody the very essence of waiterness. But this performance, Sartre argued, is a form of self-deception. The waiter is pretending to be a thing, a waiter, rather than acknowledging that he is a free consciousness who has chosen to play the role of waiter and could choose differently at any moment. Bad faith is not simply dishonesty toward others. It is a form of self-deception that involves splitting consciousness against itself. Part of us knows that we are free and responsible, but another part desperately wants to escape that freedom by pretending to be determined by forces beyond our control. This creates a kind of internal contradiction that can never be fully resolved as long as we remain in bad faith. The prevalence of bad faith reveals something important about the human condition. Radical freedom is not experienced as liberation, but as burden. Most people, when confronted with the full weight of their freedom and responsibility, feel not joy but anguish. This anguish is not fear of specific dangers, but the vertiginous recognition of our own radical openness, the realization that we must choose our values, our identity, and our future without any guarantee that our choices are correct. The weight of every moment. One of the most disturbing implications of Sartre's philosophy is that the weight of absolute choice extends to every moment of existence. We are not free only when making major life decisions, choosing a career, selecting a spouse, deciding where to live. We are free, and therefore responsible, in every moment of conscious existence. Consider what this means for something as simple as an emotional response. If I feel angry at someone's behavior, Sartre would argue that my anger is not something that simply happens to me, like catching a cold or being struck by lightning. Rather, anger is an emotional choice, a way of relating to the situation that I have selected from among various alternatives. I could have chosen to respond with disappointment, amusement, indifference, or curiosity instead of anger. This does not mean that emotions are arbitrary or that we can simply will ourselves to feel differently at any moment. Emotions have their own logic and momentum, and changing emotional patterns requires sustained effort and self-awareness. But it does mean that we are ultimately responsible for our emotional lives in ways that most people find uncomfortable to acknowledge. The same analysis applies to our thoughts, our attention, our interpretations of events, and our responses to other people. Every aspect of conscious existence involves choices, and every choice expresses our freedom while simultaneously creating who we are. We are not just responsible for our major decisions. We are responsible for the entire texture of our conscious experience. This comprehensive responsibility creates what Sartre called anguish, the recognition that we are alone in making choices that will determine not only our own future, but our understanding of what human existence should become. Unlike fear, which has a specific object, anguish is an emotional response to confronting our own radical freedom. It is the vertigo we feel when standing at the edge of possibility, knowing that we must choose our direction without any external compass to guide us. Yet Sartre insisted that this anguish, uncomfortable as it may be, is preferable to the self-deception of bad faith. Authentic existence requires that we face our freedom directly, acknowledge the full weight of our responsibility, and make our choices with clear awareness of what we are doing. This does not make choice easier or more comfortable, but it makes it honest. The paradox of freedom. Sartre's analysis of human existence reveals a fundamental paradox that lies at the heart of the human condition. We are most free precisely when we feel most constrained by the weight of our freedom. The recognition of radical responsibility, while initially experienced as a burden, ultimately becomes a foundation for authentic existence. This paradox helps explain why Sartre's philosophy has been both influential and controversial. On one hand, his insistence on radical freedom seems to offer unlimited possibilities for human development and social change. If humans have no fixed nature, then we can remake ourselves and our societies according to our highest aspirations. Oppressive social conditions, destructive psychological patterns, and limiting cultural traditions can all be overcome through conscious choice and deliberate action. On the other hand, the weight of absolute responsibility can seem crushing. If we are responsible for everything we do, think, and feel, and if our choices represent our vision of what all humanity should become, then even the smallest decisions carry enormous moral weight. The freedom to choose becomes indistinguishable from the obligation to choose correctly, even though there are no external standards for determining what correctly might mean. Sartre never resolved this paradox, and perhaps it cannot be resolved. It may represent something fundamental about the human condition, that we are beings who cannot help but experience our freedom as both liberation and burden, both opportunity and obligation. The goal is not to eliminate the tension, but to live authentically within it, making our choices with full awareness of their significance, while refusing to escape into the false comfort of bad faith. This philosophical framework would lead Sartre to develop distinctive approaches to ethics, politics, psychology, and social theory, all based on a fundamental insight that human beings are radically free and therefore radically responsible for creating themselves and their world. Unlike Camus, who found in the recognition of absurdity a reason to embrace immediate experience with passion and intensity, Sartre found in the recognition of radical freedom a call to authentic choice and social engagement that would shape his entire intellectual and political career. The weight of absolute choice in every moment means that human existence is always a project, an ongoing effort to create meaning, identity, and value through conscious decision and deliberate action. We are never finished with this project. Every moment presents new choices that will contribute to determining who we are and what human existence becomes. This is simultaneously the burden and the glory of human consciousness. We are condemned to be free, but this condemnation is also our greatest opportunity for authentic existence. Part 6. Sartre's response. Authentic existence and engagement. If Camus asks us to imagine Sisyphus happy, Sartre asks us to imagine ourselves free, radically, terrifyingly, absolutely free. But what does it mean to live authentically in the face of such overwhelming freedom? How do we navigate a world where every choice carries the weight of defining not just ourselves, but humanity itself? The pursuit of authenticity, living our freedom. For Jean-Paul Sartre, authenticity isn't just a philosophical ideal. It's an urgent moral imperative. Unlike traditional ethical systems that provide ready-made rules and guidelines, Sartrean authenticity demands that we create our own values through the very act of choosing. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of his philosophy. We cannot escape the responsibility of constant self-creation. Authenticity, for Sartre, means living in full acknowledgement of our radical freedom and accepting complete responsibility for our choices. It means recognizing that we are, in his famous phrase, condemned to be free, thrown into existence without our consent, but nonetheless responsible for everything we make of that existence. But what does authentic living look like in practice? Sartre argues that authenticity requires us to embrace what he calls our facticity, the concrete circumstances into which we're thrown, while simultaneously recognizing our transcendence, our ability to project ourselves beyond these circumstances toward future possibilities. Consider the young man who came to Sartre during World War II, tore between joining the resistance or staying home to care for his mother. Traditional moral systems might offer clear guidance: duty to country, duty to family, utilitarian calculations of greater good. But Sartre's response was characteristically uncompromising. No external authority can make this choice for you. The values you create through choosing will determine not just your action, but who you become. This example illustrates a crucial aspect of Sartrean authenticity. We must choose without guarantee, without certainty that we're making the right choice. Authenticity isn't about finding the correct answer. It's about taking full ownership of our choices and their consequences. Anxiety as the compass of freedom, that restless feeling, that vague unease that seems to have no specific object. Sartre calls this anxiety or anguish, and he sees it as perhaps our most authentic emotion. Far from being a disorder to be cured, anxiety is the emotional signature of our freedom. Sartre distinguishes between fear and anxiety in a crucial way. Fear as an object. We fear the snake, the exam, the diagnosis. But anxiety is objectless. It's the vertigo we feel when confronted with the sheer possibility of our freedom. When we stand at the edge of a cliff, we don't just fear falling. We experience anxiety at the realization that we could choose to jump. This anxiety reveals our radical freedom in its purest form. This explains why anxiety often accompanies our most significant life decisions. The college student choosing a major, the professional considering a career change, the person contemplating marriage or divorce, all experience anxiety not because the outcomes are predetermined to be negative, but because they recognize the profound responsibility of choosing who they will become. Sartre argues that those who live authentically don't seek to eliminate anxiety, but learn to recognize it as a signal that they are confronting a genuine choice. The person who never feels anxious may be living in bad faith, avoiding the difficult decisions that would force them to confront their freedom. This perspective transforms our relationship with uncertainty. Rather than seeing anxiety as evidence that we're on the wrong path, Sartre suggests it might indicate we're finally on an authentic one. The goal isn't to find a life free from anxiety, but to develop the courage to make choices despite it. Being for others, the social dimension of authenticity. Perhaps no aspect of Sartre philosophy is more challenging than his analysis of how we exist in relationship to others. His famous declaration that hell is other people is often misunderstood as misanthropy, but it actually reveals profound insight into the structure of human consciousness and social existence. When Sartre says we are being for others, he means that our self-consciousness is fundamentally shaped by how others see us. We cannot know ourselves as pure subjects because we are always already objects in the world of others. This creates what Sartre calls the look, the experience of being observed and judged by another consciousness. Consider the simple act of walking through a public space. When alone, we move unself-consciously, perhaps humming to ourselves, adjusting our clothes without thought. But the moment we notice someone watching us, everything changes. We become aware of our posture, our expression, our pace. We see ourselves as an object in their world, and this fundamentally alters our experience of being ourselves. This dynamic creates both the possibility and the challenge of authentic existence in relationship to others. On one hand, others provide us with perspectives on ourselves that we can never achieve alone. Through their eyes, we discover aspects of our being that would otherwise remain hidden. On the other hand, this same process can lead us into bad faith if we begin to define ourselves entirely through others' perceptions. The authentic person, according to Sartre, must navigate this tension carefully. They must remain open to how others see them without surrendering their fundamental freedom to define themselves. This requires a delicate balance, being influenced by others without being determined by them. This has profound implications for how we understand love, friendship, and all human relationships. Sartre argues that love always contains an element of conflict because each person seeks to be freely chosen by the other while simultaneously wanting to be their entire world. We want to be loved for who we authentically are, but we also want our beloved to find us so compelling that they cannot imagine choosing anyone else. Political engagement as authentic expression. For Sartre, political engagement isn't optional for the authentic individual. It's an inevitable consequence of taking our freedom and responsibility seriously. Because our choices always occur in a social context and affect others, seemingly personal decisions are inherently political. When Sartre joined the Communist Party briefly, and later became involved in various leftist causes, he wasn't abandoning philosophy for politics. He was extending his philosophical principles into the realm of collective action. If we are responsible for what we make a humanity through our choices, then we cannot remain indifferent to conditions that limit or expand human freedom. This political dimension of authenticity distinguishes Sartre sharply from more individualistic philosophers. For Sartre, the hermit who withdraws from society to live authentically in isolation is actually living in bad faith because they're denying their fundamental interdependence with others. True authenticity requires engagement with the world and its problems, but Sartre's political engagement was never simple partisanship. He famously broke with the Communist Party over their response to the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, demonstrating that authentic political engagement requires maintaining one's critical faculties even toward movements one supports. The authentic person cannot surrender their freedom to any ideology, even one they find generally compelling. This creates a tension that runs throughout Sartre's political writings. How does one commit to collective action while maintaining individual authenticity? His answer evolves throughout his career, but he consistently argues that we must remain committed to expanding human freedom for all, not just for ourselves. The cafe waiter, bad faith in action. No example better illustrates Sartre's concept of bad faith than his famous description of a cafe waiter who seems to be playing at being a cafe waiter. Sartre describes watching this waiter move through his duties with exaggerated precision. His movements a bit too quick, a bit too precise, his eagerness a bit too solicitous. What troubles Sartre isn't that the man is doing his job well, but that he seems to be hiding behind his role. The waiter has allowed his professional identity to completely subsume his individual identity. He has convinced himself that he simply is a waiter, not a free human being who happens to work as a waiter, but someone whose essence is defined entirely by his professional function. This represents bad faith because the waiter is denying his fundamental freedom. He pretends that his actions are determined by his role, rather than chosen by a moment to moment. When a customer treats him rudely, he can tell himself that's just part of being a waiter, rather than recognizing that he chooses how to respond to rudeness. The cafe waiter example resonates because we all recognize similar patterns in our own lives. How often do we hide behind our roles, parent, student, professional, citizen, rather than owning our choices within those roles? How often do we say, I have to, when we really mean I choose to? Bad faith isn't necessarily pathological. It can provide temporary relief from the burden of constant choice. But Sartre argues that it ultimately imprisons us within limitations we create for ourselves. The authentic alternative isn't to reject all social roles, but to inhabit them freely, recognizing that we choose how to interpret and fulfill our responsibilities. The waiter could perform the same actions authentically by acknowledging that he chooses to be helpful, chooses to be professional, chooses to find dignity in service. The difference isn't in the behavior, but in the consciousness behind it, the courage of authentic living. Living authentically according to Sartre's vision requires tremendous courage. It means accepting that we are the authors of our own values, that our choices matter not just for ourselves but for all humanity, and that we cannot escape into the comfort of predetermined meanings or roles. This courage manifests in multiple ways. The courage to feel anxiety without fleeing from it, the courage to make choices without certainty, the courage to take responsibility for outcomes we never fully intended, and the courage to remain engaged with others and with political reality despite the conflicts this engagement inevitably creates. But Sartre doesn't present this as a grim duty. There is joy in authentic existence, the joy of recognizing our profound creative power, the joy of genuine connection with others who also choose authenticity, and the joy of participating in the ongoing project of human liberation. For Sartre, we are not just condemned to be free, we are privileged to be free. The burden of choice is also the glory of human consciousness. In choosing authentically, we don't just create ourselves. We participate in the endless human project of creating meaning in a universe that provides none ready-made. This vision challenges us to see our daily choices, how we treat a difficult colleague, whether we speak up about injustice, how we respond to our own failures, as opportunities for authentic self-creation. Each moment presents us with the possibility of choosing who we will become, and in that choice lies both the terror and the beauty of human existence. Part 7, Point to Convergence, Shared Insights. Despite their philosophical differences and occasional personal tensions, Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre share a remarkable foundation of insights about the human condition. Their convergence on fundamental questions reveals why both thinkers emerged from the same historical moment and why their ideas continue to resonate together. Understanding their shared ground helps us appreciate how different responses to existential challenges can complement rather than contradict each other. The collapse of traditional certainties. Both Camus and Sartre begin from the same devastating recognition. The traditional sources of meaning that sustained humanity for millennia have lost their power to convince. God, natural law, predetermined human essence, historical progress, absolute moral systems. All these pillars of meaning have crumbled under the weight of modern scrutiny. This wasn't merely an intellectual exercise for either philosopher. Both lived through World War II, witnessing the collapse of civilized norms and the revelation that no divine intervention would save humanity from its own capacity for destruction. They saw how quickly societies could abandon moral principles, how easily individuals could commit atrocities while invoking higher purposes, and how thoroughly the war exposed the absence of any cosmic guarantee that good would triumph over evil. Camus articulates this recognition through his concept of the absurd, the collision between human need for meaning and the universe's indifferent silence. When we call out for answers, the universe doesn't respond with hostility. It simply doesn't respond at all. This silence is more disturbing than any negative answer, because it forces us to confront the possibility that our questions themselves may be meaningless. Sartre approaches the same insight through his famous declaration that existence precedes essence. Traditional philosophy and theology assume that humans have a predetermined nature or purpose, an essence that exists before and determines our actual existence. But Sartre argues that we simply find ourselves existing without any blueprint or instruction manual. We exist first, as raw consciousness thrown into being, and only then must we create whatever essence or identity we will have. Both philosophers recognize that this collapse of traditional meaning sources isn't merely an intellectual problem. It's an existential crisis that affects how we live, love, work, and die. The absence of predetermined meaning doesn't make life easier. It makes it more challenging, because we can no longer rely on external authorities to tell us what matters or how to live. Yet neither philosopher treats this collapse as an unmitigated tragedy. They see it as a liberation that, while initially terrifying, ultimately opens up possibilities for more authentic forms of human existence. The death of false certainties clears space for genuine human creativity and responsibility. The burden and gift of creating values. With traditional sources of meaning collapsed, both Camus and Sartre insist that humans must take responsibility for creating their own values. This represents one of their most profound convergences, the recognition that we cannot escape the responsibility of value creation, but that this responsibility is simultaneously our burden and our glory. For Camus, this value creation happens through the act of living fully despite meaninglessness. When Sisyphus chooses to find joy in pushing his boulder up the mountain, he's not discovering a pre-existing meaning in his task. He's creating meaning through his commitment to it. The absurd hero creates values through acts of revolt, creation, and passionate engagement with life, all while maintaining full awareness that these values have no cosmic endorsement. Sartre makes this responsibility even more explicit. Every choice we make is simultaneously a choice about what kind of person we want to be and what kind of world we think should exist. When we choose, we're not just selecting between pre-existing options, we're creating the values by which we choose. The young man torn between joining the resistance or caring for his mother cannot appeal to any external moral authority, because his choice will determine what values he considers most important. Both philosophers recognize how overwhelming this responsibility can feel. Camus describes the initial shock of recognizing our absurd condition, while Sartre analyzes the anxiety that accompanies authentic choice-making. The weight of creating meaning, without guarantee, can lead to despair or paralysis. But both also find this responsibility exhilarating. Camus celebrates the creative power of the absurd hero, who continues to create and love despite cosmic indifference. Sartre emphasizes the radical freedom that comes with recognizing our power to transcend our circumstances and project ourselves towards self-chosen possibilities. This convergence helps explain why both philosophers ultimately sound notes of hope rather than despair. Yes, we must create our own values without cosmic backing, but this means that human creativity and choice matter enormously. Our decisions aren't predetermined by external forces. They genuinely create new possibilities in the world. Consciousness as burden and gift. Both Camus and Sartre view human consciousness as fundamentally ambiguous, simultaneously our greatest burden and our most precious gift. This shared insight shapes their entire philosophical projects and explains their complex relationship with human rationality and self-awareness. Consciousness is a burden because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our condition. Animals don't suffer from existential anxiety because they lack the self-awareness to recognize their mortality, their lack of predetermined purpose, or the ultimate meaninglessness of their activities. Humans, cursed with consciousness, cannot escape these recognitions. Camus explores this burden through his analysis of how consciousness creates the absurd. It's precisely because we are rational beings seeking meaning that we experience the collision with an irrational universe. A being without consciousness wouldn't experience absurdity. It would simply exist without questioning its existence. Sartre analyzes the burden of consciousness through his concept of nothingness that lies at the heart of human being. Human consciousness is defined by its capacity to negate, to say no, to imagine what is not yet real. This power of negation allows us to transcend our immediate circumstances, but also means we can never simply be present in the way objects are present. We're always aware of what we're not, what we might become, what we've failed to achieve. Yet both philosophers also celebrate consciousness as humanity's defining gift. Without consciousness, we couldn't create art, form loving relationships, or take responsibility for our choices. The very capacity that makes us aware of our absurd condition also gives us the power to respond to it creatively. For Camus, consciousness enables the act of revolt, creation, and love that define the absurd hero. We can appreciate beauty, create meaning through our commitments, and find solidarity with other conscious beings precisely because we're aware of our shared condition. For Sartre, consciousness is a foundation of our radical freedom. Our ability to imagine alternative possibilities, to negate current circumstances, and to project ourselves toward future goals makes authentic existence possible. Without consciousness, we couldn't choose who to become or take responsibility for our impact on others. This shared perspective on consciousness helps explain why both philosophers resist simple optimism or pessimism about the human condition. Consciousness makes life more difficult, but also more meaningful. It creates problems that wouldn't exist without it, but it also provides the only possible solutions to those problems. The imperative of honest confrontation. Both Camus and Sartre insist that authentic living requires honest confrontation with our existential condition. We cannot build genuine lives on illusions, self-deceptions, or comforting lies. This commitment to honesty represents one of their deepest convergences and helps explain their shared critique of various forms of escapism. Camus develops this theme through his rejection of what he calls philosophical suicide, the leap into religious faith, metaphysical systems, or political ideologies that promise to resolve the absurd condition through appeals to transcendent meaning. He argues that once we've recognized the silence of the universe, we cannot honestly pretend we haven't heard it. The absurd hero accepts this silence and learns to live fully within it rather than escaping into false hopes. This doesn't mean Camus rejects all forms of hope or commitment. Rather, he insists that our hopes and commitments must be grounded in clear-eyed recognition of our actual condition. We can love other people while acknowledging that love doesn't solve the problem of mortality. We can create art while recognizing that art doesn't provide cosmic justification for existence. We can fight injustice while acknowledging that justice isn't guaranteed by the structure of reality. Sartre approaches the same imperative through his analysis of bad faith, the various ways we deceive ourselves about our freedom and responsibility. We act in bad faith when we pretend our choices are determined by external forces, when we reduce ourselves to our social roles, or when we convince ourselves that our current situation is unchangeable. Bad faith is tempting because it relieves us of the anxiety that accompanies authentic choice-making. It's easier to say, "I had no choice," than to acknowledge that we chose one difficult option among several difficult options. It's more comfortable to define ourselves entirely through our professional identities than to take responsibility for how we choose to inhabit those identities. But Sartre argues that bad faith ultimately impoverishes our lives by cutting us off from our creative possibilities. When we deny our freedom, we also deny our capacity, to transcend our current circumstances and create new ways of being. Both philosophers recognize that honest confrontation with our condition isn't a one-time achievement, but an ongoing practice. We constantly face new temptations to escape into comforting illusions or to deny aspects of our situation that make us uncomfortable. Authentic living requires continuous vigilance against these temptations. This shared commitment to honesty helps explain why both philosophers can sound harsh or demanding in their prescriptions for authentic living. They're not interested in making life easier or more comfortable. They're interested in making it more genuine and creative. Hope in human capacity for self-determination. Despite their unflinching analysis of human limitations and the absence of cosmic meaning, both Camus and Sartre ultimately express profound hope in human capacity for self-determination. This hope isn't based on faith in external salvation or guarantee of progress. It's based on their observation of what humans actually accomplish when they take responsibility for their own existence. Camus finds hope in the very act of continuing to live and create despite absurdity. The fact that humans keep making art, forming relationships, and fighting injustice even after recognizing the silence of the universe demonstrates something remarkable about human nature. We don't need cosmic endorsement to create beauty or to love each other. The very persistence of human creativity in the face of meaninglessness becomes a form of meaning itself. His image of Sisyphus represents this hope perfectly. Sisyphus is condemned to an eternally meaningless task. Yet Camus asks us to imagine him happy. This happiness doesn't come from finding hidden meaning in boulder pushing. It comes from Sisyphus' decision to embrace his task fully, to find satisfaction in his own strength and persistence, to create meaning through his very refusal to despair. Sartre locates hope in human freedom itself. Despite all the forces that constrain us, biological needs, social pressures, historical circumstances, humans consistently demonstrate their capacity to transcend these constraints and create new possibilities. Even in the most oppressive situations, people find ways to maintain their dignity, to help others, and to work toward better conditions. This hope shapes Sartre's political engagement. He becomes involved in various social causes not because he believes in guaranteed progress, but because he sees evidence of human capacity to create change. When people organize for justice, they demonstrate their refusal to accept current conditions as permanent. When individuals choose to act courageously despite personal risk, they prove that human freedom is real and powerful. Both philosophers find hope in human solidarity. We may be thrown into existence without our consent, but we're not thrown in alone. Others share our condition, and this shared predicament creates possibilities for mutual understanding and support. Camus writes about solidarity among those who recognize their absurd condition, while Sartre analyzes how our fundamental interdependence can become a source of strength rather than just conflict. This hope doesn't eliminate the tragic dimensions of human existence. Both philosophers acknowledge that suffering, death, and failure are inevitable. But it does suggest that humans have the capacity to respond to these tragic elements with creativity, courage, and compassion. The courage required for authentic living. Both Camus and Sartre recognize that authentic living requires tremendous courage. This isn't the courage of the battlefield or the adventure story. It's the more subtle but perhaps more demanding courage required to live honestly in the face of uncertainty, to take responsibility without guarantee, and create meaning while acknowledging its fragility. The absurd hero displays courage by continuing to live fully despite recognizing the meaninglessness of existence. This courage manifests in multiple ways. The courage to love someone despite knowing that love cannot conquer death. The courage to create art despite knowing that art cannot solve ultimate questions. The courage to fight injustice despite knowing that justice will never be perfectly achieved. Camus emphasizes that this courage doesn't eliminate suffering. It transforms our relationship to suffering. The absurd hero suffers, but chooses how to respond to that suffering. This choice doesn't remove pain, but prevents pain from defining the entire meaning of existence. Sartre identifies courage with the willingness to embrace our radical freedom despite the anxiety it creates. It takes courage to make authentic choices when we cannot be certain of their consequences. It takes courage to take responsibility for our impact on others when we cannot control how they will respond to us. It takes courage to remain engaged with political reality when that reality often seems intractable or hopeless. Both philosophers suggest that this courage is not a natural gift, but a capacity that must be developed through practice. We learn courage by acting courageously, by making difficult choices and living with their consequences, by refusing to escape into comfortable illusions when reality becomes challenging. This courage also has a social dimension. Both Camus and Sartre recognize that authentic living is easier when we find others who share our commitment to honesty and responsibility. Courage becomes contagious. When we see others living authentically despite difficulties, we're inspired to do the same. The convergence between Camus and Sartre on the question of courage reveals something crucial about their shared vision. Neither presents authentic living as easy or comfortable. Both demand that we rise to meet the full challenge of human existence without the support of external guarantees or predetermined meanings. Yet both also suggest that this demanding path ultimately leads to a richer, more meaningful existence than any alternative. The courage required for authentic living isn't just a price we pay for honesty. It's itself a source of dignity and satisfaction. In choosing to live courageously despite uncertainty, we demonstrate something valuable about human potential and create possibilities for others to do the same. This shared emphasis on courage helps explain why both philosophers continue to inspire readers decades after their deaths. They don't offer easy solutions or comforting reassurances, but they do provide models of how to live with integrity in a complex and challenging world. Their convergence on these fundamental insights creates a foundation from which we can explore their distinctive contributions and differences. Part 8. Divergent Paths, where they part ways. While Camus and Sartre share fundamental insights about the human condition, their responses to these shared recognitions lead them down markedly different philosophical paths. These divergences aren't merely academic disagreements. They represent fundamentally different orientations toward living in an absurd world, each offering distinct wisdom about how to navigate existential challenges. Limits versus limitless freedom. Perhaps the most fundamental difference between Camus and Sartre lies in their attitudes toward human limitations. Camus emphasizes the importance of recognizing and accepting our limits, while Sartre celebrates our capacity to transcend virtually any constraint to the power of consciousness and choice. For Camus, wisdom begins with acknowledging what we cannot do or know. We cannot escape our mortality. We cannot achieve perfect knowledge. And we cannot create meaning that exists independently of our own commitment to it. The absurd hero finds dignity precisely in accepting these limitations while continuing to live fully within them. Sisyphus cannot escape his eternal punishment, but he can choose how to experience it. This emphasis on limits shapes Camus' entire philosophical approach. He advocates for what he calls Mediterranean thinking, a philosophical style that seeks balance, measure, and proportion rather than absolute solutions. The ancient Greeks, he argues, understood something crucial about human flourishing. It requires accepting our place in the natural order rather than trying to transcend it entirely. Sartre, by contrast, sees human consciousness as fundamentally defined by a capacity to transcend limitations. While we cannot escape our facticity, the concrete circumstances into which we're thrown, we can always transcend these circumstances by projecting ourselves toward new possibilities. Even in the most constrained situations, humans retain the radical freedom to choose their attitude toward their constraints. This difference becomes particularly clear in their approaches to social and historical circumstances. Camus tends to see certain historical forces and social structures as relatively fixed constraints within which we must find ways to live authentically. Sartre views these same forces as obstacles that can potentially be overcome through collective action and individual commitment to change. The divergence reflects different temperaments as much as different philosophies. Camus, shaped by his North African childhood and his experience with tuberculosis, develops a philosophy that emphasizes acceptance of natural limits and finding beauty within constraints. Sartre, intellectually precocious and politically engaged from an early age, developed a philosophy that emphasizes the mind's power to reshape both self and world. Individual hero versus social being. This fundamental difference about limits extends into their contrasting views of whether authentic existence is primarily an individual or collective achievement. Camus' absurd hero is essentially solitary, finding meaning through personal revolt, creation, and passion. Sartre's authentic individual is inevitably social, creating meaning through relationships and collective action. Camus' literary heroes, Massault and the Stranger, Dr. Roux and the Plague, Jean-Baptiste Clements in The Fall, are all fundamentally alone in their confrontation with absurdity, even when they act in solidarity with others, as Dr. Roux does during Plague. Their authenticity comes from their individual recognition of and response to their condition. The absurd hero cannot depend on others for validation or meaning. They must find these within themselves. This solitary quality doesn't make Camus' heroes antisocial or selfish. Rather, their individual authenticity enables genuine connection with others who share their condition. But the foundation of their existence remains individual recognition and acceptance of absurdity. They can offer solidarity to others, but they cannot derive their meaning from collective projects or shared ideologies. Sartre, by contrast, argues that authentic existence is impossible in isolation because human consciousness is fundamentally structured by our relationships with others. We know ourselves only through the eyes of others, and our choices always affect and are affected by the social world around us. The hermit who withdraws from society to live authentically in isolation is actually living in bad faith because they're denying their fundamental interdependence. This difference shapes their entire approach to ethics and politics. For Camus, ethical action springs from individual recognition of shared human condition. We act justly because we recognize that others suffer as we do. For Sartre, ethical action springs from recognition that our individual choices inevitably shape the social world. We act responsibly because we recognize that in choosing for ourselves, we choose for all humanity. Political engagement, measured distance versus total commitment. Perhaps nowhere do Camus and Sartre diverge more dramatically than in their approaches to political engagement. Both recognize that authentic living requires some form of engagement with social and political reality, but they advocate for radically different forms of that engagement. Camus advocates for what might be called measured rebellion, opposition to injustice that maintains critical distance from all political movements and ideologies. Having witnessed how quickly political causes can corrupt their adherents, he insists on the importance of maintaining individual judgment, even when working for collective goals. The authentic rebel fights specific injustices without surrendering to the totalizing logic of any political system. This approach led Camus to support the French resistance during World War II while remaining skeptical of post-war communist movements. He opposed colonialism in Algeria while rejecting both French colonial policy and revolutionary terrorism. His famous essay, The Rebel, argues that authentic rebellion seeks to expand human dignity and freedom, while revolution often ends up creating new forms of oppression. Sartre, by contrast, advocates for total commitment to political causes that align with human liberation. Once convinced that a particular movement serves the cause of expanding human freedom, the authentic individual should commit fully to that movement, accepting its discipline and working within its structure. Half-hearted political engagement is a form of bad faith because it denies the full implications of our radical freedom and responsibility. This commitment led Sartre to join the Communist Party, support various revolutionary movements, and maintain his political engagement even when these movements proved disappointing or problematic. His later writings increasingly emphasize the collective dimensions of human freedom and the necessity of working through existing political organizations to create change. The personal tensions between Camus and Sartre often centered on this political divide. Sartre viewed Camus' measured approach as bourgeois evasion of revolutionary necessity, while Camus saw Sartre's total commitment as dangerous surrender of individual critical judgment to collective ideology. Hope, lucid indifference versus radical project. Their different approaches to political engagement reflect deeper differences about the role of hope in authentic existence. Both philosophers reject naive optimism, but they offer contrasting alternatives to simple hopefulness or despair. Camus develops what he calls lucid indifference, a stance that combines clear-eyed recognition of life's tragic dimensions with continued commitment to living fully despite these tragedies. The absurd hero doesn't hope for ultimate solutions or cosmic justice, but finds satisfaction in the immediate experience of revolt, creation, and love. This indifference isn't coldness or apathy. It's freedom from the need for external validation or guarantee. This lucid indifference allows the absurd hero to act without being paralyzed by uncertainty about outcomes. Dr. Roux fights the plague not because he believes he can eliminate disease from human existence, but because fighting disease is an expression of human solidarity and dignity. The action itself, rather than its ultimate consequences, provides meaning. Sartre maintains what might be called radical project, the commitment to transforming current conditions even without guarantee of success. While acknowledging that we cannot know whether our projects will succeed, he argues that authentic existence requires projecting ourselves toward future possibilities and working to realize them. Hope isn't naive optimism, but commitment to action based on our vision of what human existence could become. This difference reflects their contrasting temperaments and life experiences. Camus, having confronted mortality through tuberculosis and witnessed the cyclical nature of historical violence, develops a philosophy that finds meaning in present experience rather than future achievement. Sartre, intellectually ambitious and politically engaged, developed a philosophy that finds meaning in commitment to changing the world. Literary expression, novels of alienation versus plays of choice. These philosophical differences find expression in their contrasting approaches to literature. Both writers use fictional works to explore philosophical themes, but their literary choices reflect their different emphases and concerns. Camus writes novels that explore individual confrontation with absurd conditions. The Stranger follows Massault's alienated passage through a world that makes no sense to him. The Plague examines how individuals respond when normal life is disrupted by inexplicable catastrophe. The Fall presents a complex meditation on guilt, judgment, and the impossibility of innocence. In each case, the focus remains on individual consciousness, encountering circumstances beyond its control. These novels typically feature protagonists who are somewhat passive observers of their own lives, struggling to understand experiences that seem to happen to them rather than choices they make. Even when they act decisively, as Dr. Ruse does in Fighting the Plague, their action feels more like recognition and acceptance of their condition than like radical self-creation. Sartre writes plays that dramatize moments of choice and their consequences. No Exit explores how three people create hell for each other through their refusal to accept responsibility for their freedom. The Flies reimagines the Orestes myth to show how an individual can choose to take responsibility for collective liberation. Dirty Hands examines the moral complexities faced by intellectuals who choose to engage in political action. These plays typically feature protagonists who face clear choices with significant consequences. The dramatic tension centers on whether characters will choose authentically or retreat into bad faith. Even when they make tragic mistakes, as Hugo does in Dirty Hands, their choices reveal the weight and reality of human freedom. The literary difference reflects their philosophical divide. Camus explores how individuals can live meaningfully within constraints they cannot change, while Sartre dramatizes how individuals can transform themselves and their world through authentic choice. Both approaches offer valuable insights, but they lead readers toward different understandings of human possibility and responsibility. Complementary wisdom. These divergences between Camus and Sartre shouldn't be seen as contradictions requiring resolution, but as complementary approaches to the fundamental challenges of human existence. Some individuals and situations call for Camus' emphasis on accepting limits and finding meaning within constraints. Others require Sartre's emphasis on transcending circumstances through radical commitment and choice. Their different paths up the same existential mountain offer us multiple resources for navigating our own confrontations with meaninglessness, freedom, and responsibility. In understanding where they part ways, we better appreciate the range of authentic responses available to us in our own search for meaningful existence. Part 9. Contemporary Relevance. Living the Questions Today. The existential challenges that Camus and Sartre confronted in the aftermath of 2 world wars have not disappeared. They have evolved and intensified in our contemporary moment. Their insights offer surprisingly relevant guidance for navigating particular forms of meaninglessness, freedom, and responsibility that define 21st century existence. Far from being historical curiosities, their philosophies provide essential tools for understanding and responding to the unique existential crises of our time. Modern existential challenges. The persistence of the absurd. Today's world presents us with new versions of the fundamental questions that drove both philosophers. How do we find meaning in a universe that seems indifferent to human concerns? How do we take responsibility for our choices when the consequences of those choices extend far beyond what we can comprehend or control? How do we maintain authentic existence in a world increasingly dominated by systems that seem to operate independently of human values? The collapse of traditional meaning structures that Camus and Sartre witnessed has accelerated rather than reversed. Religious authority continues to decline in many societies. Political ideologies have proven repeatedly inadequate to address complex global challenges, and scientific progress, while remarkable, has not provided the moral guidance that some expected it would offer. We live in what many sociologists call a post-truth era, where competing narratives about reality make it increasingly difficult to establish shared foundations for meaning-making. Yet this collapse has also created new possibilities for authentic self-creation that both philosophers would recognize. The weakening of traditional authorities means that individuals have more freedom than ever to choose their own values, relationships, and life directions. The challenge, as both Camus and Sartre understood, is learning to use this freedom responsibly rather than being overwhelmed by it. Contemporary anxiety about finding yourself or living your best life reflects the same existential challenges they analyze, but in new forms. The modern emphasis on individual fulfillment and self-optimization can become another form of escape from authentic confrontation with our condition. Both philosophers would likely view much contemporary self-help culture as a sophisticated form of bad faith, an attempt to find guaranteed formulas for meaningful living that avoid the difficult work of constant self-creation and choice. Technology and social media, the digital absurd. Perhaps no aspect of contemporary life would have fascinated Camus and Sartre more than our relationship with digital technology and social media. These platforms create new forms of both the absurd condition and the possibilities for bad faith that their philosophies help us understand. Social media platforms promise connection and meaning, but often deliver their opposite. Endless scrolling through curated versions of other people's lives, seeking validation through metrics that ultimately feel hollow, and comparing our inner experience to others' carefully crafted public presentations. This creates a distinctly modern form of absurdity, the collision between our need for authentic connection and the artificial nature of digital relationships. Camus' concept of the absurd hero provides valuable guidance for navigating this digital landscape. Instead of seeking meaning through external validation or trying to optimize our online presence for maximum engagement, we can approach social media with the lucid indifference he advocated. We can use these platforms while remaining fully aware of their limitations, finding authentic connection where possible while refusing to let digital metrics define our self-worth. Sartre's analysis of bad faith proves equally relevant to our digital age. The temptation to curate perfect online personas represents a sophisticated form of self-deception. We begin to mistake our carefully crafted digital selves for our authentic identities. The endless scroll of content consumption can become a way of avoiding the anxiety that accompanies authentic choice-making. We can lose hours consuming other people's content while avoiding the difficult work of creating our own meaning. Yet technology also creates new possibilities for authentic existence. Digital platforms can enable forms of creative expression, political organization, and genuine connection that weren't possible in Camus and Sartre's era. The key, from both philosophical perspectives, is maintaining awareness of our freedom to choose how we engage with these technologies rather than letting them determine our experience. The phenomenon of online activism illustrates both the possibilities and dangers they would recognize. Digital platforms can enable rapid organization around social causes and give voice to previously marginalized perspectives. But they can also create the illusion of meaningful political engagement through symbolic actions, sharing posts, signing online petitions, engaging in performative outrage that substitute for more difficult work of sustained commitment to change. Climate change, confronting planetary absurdity. Climate change presents perhaps the ultimate test of both philosophical frameworks for contemporary readers. The scale and timeline of environmental challenges seem to exceed human capacity for comprehension or effective response, creating a form of absurdity that might have staggered even Camus and Sartre. From a Camusian perspective, climate change represents the absurd condition writ large. We find ourselves in a situation where individual actions feel simultaneously crucial and utterly inadequate. We can make personal choices to reduce our environmental impact, but the scale of required change seems to exceed what individual action can accomplish. The rational response might be despair or paralysis, But the absurd hero continues to act anyway, not because action guarantees success, but because action expresses human dignity and solidarity. This Camusian approach suggests focusing on what we can actually control while acknowledging the limits of our influence. We can choose to live more sustainably, support environmental policies, and find meaning in the act of caring for the world, even if we cannot single-handedly solve climate change. The goal isn't to eliminate anxiety about environmental futures, but to act authentically within that anxiety. Sartre's framework emphasizes our collective responsibility and the necessity of political engagement. Climate change demonstrates how individual choices inevitably have social and political dimensions. Our personal carbon footprints are shaped by infrastructure and policy decisions made collectively. Authentic response requires not just individual lifestyle changes, but commitment to political movements that can create systemic change. Both perspectives converge on the importance of honest confrontation with climate reality rather than denial or false optimism. They would likely critique both those who ignore environmental challenges and those who claim certainty about technological solutions. The authentic response involves acting on current knowledge while acknowledging uncertainty about outcomes. Mental health and philosophical honesty. Contemporary discussions of mental health often struggle with questions that both philosophers address directly. When is psychological suffering a sign of illness requiring treatment? And when is a natural response to difficult existential conditions? Their insights offer valuable perspective on the therapeutic value of philosophical honesty. Both Camus and Sartre would likely view anxiety, depression, and existential crisis as potentially authentic responses to genuine features of human existence rather than simply medical problems requiring pharmaceutical solutions. This doesn't mean they would oppose therapeutic intervention, but they would insist on maintaining awareness of the existential dimensions of psychological distress. Camus' concept of the absurd provides a framework for understanding why life often feels meaningless or overwhelming. Rather than pathologizing these feelings, we can recognize them as potentially accurate perceptions of our actual situation. The goal isn't to eliminate existential anxiety, but to learn to live creatively within it. This perspective can reduce the additional suffering that comes from believing we shouldn't feel anxious or depressed about genuinely difficult aspects of existence. Sartre's analysis of bad faith offers insight into how some forms of psychological distress might stem from avoiding rather than confronting our freedom and responsibility. Depression can sometimes involve convincing ourselves that we have no choices or that our current situation is unchangeable. Anxiety can stem from recognizing our freedom to choose but feeling overwhelmed by that responsibility. Both philosophical approaches emphasize that psychological well-being doesn't require eliminating all forms of suffering or achieving permanent happiness. Instead, it involves developing capacity to respond authentically to both positive and negative experiences while maintaining our fundamental freedom to choose our attitude toward our circumstances. Balancing individual and social responsibility. One of the most pressing challenges for contemporary readers is finding balance between individual authenticity and social responsibility, a tension that both philosophers navigated in different ways. Their contrasting approaches offer complementary guidance for this ongoing challenge. Modern life presents us with competing demands. We're encouraged to be authentic and follow our dreams while also being responsible members of communities, families, and global society. The individualistic emphasis of much contemporary culture can lead to narcissistic self-focus, while excessive emphasis on social responsibility can lead to self-sacrifice that undermines authentic existence. Camus' approach suggests maintaining individual authenticity as a foundation for genuine social contribution. We can only offer authentic solidarity to others if we've honestly confronted our own condition. This means taking time for solitary reflection and individual meaning-making while remaining open to connection with others who share our fundamental situation. Sartre's approach emphasizes that individual authenticity is impossible without social engagement. Our choices always affect others, and authentic existence requires taking responsibility for these effects. This means moving beyond pure self-focus to consider how our individual projects can contribute to expanding human freedom more broadly. In practical terms, this balance might involve choosing careers that allow for both personal fulfillment and social contribution, maintaining individual interests and relationships while also engaging with community concerns, and developing personal meaning-making practices that enhance rather than undermine our capacity for social responsibility. Practical applications in daily life. Both philosophies offer concrete guidance for navigating everyday decisions and challenges. Their insights can inform everything from career choices to relationship decisions to responses to setbacks and failures. In work life, both perspectives emphasize choosing authentic engagement over external markers of success. This doesn't necessarily mean abandoning practical concerns about income or security, but it does mean maintaining awareness of our freedom to choose how we approach whatever work we do. We can find meaning in jobs that aren't intrinsically meaningful by choosing to perform them excellently and treating colleagues with dignity. In relationships, both philosophies emphasize honest communication and mutual recognition of each person's fundamental freedom. Authentic relationships require accepting that we cannot control how others respond to us while taking full responsibility for how we choose to treat them. This creates relationships based on genuine choice rather than dependency or manipulation. In facing setbacks or failures, both approaches emphasize learning to respond authentically rather than trying to avoid negative experiences entirely. Failures can become opportunities for honest self-assessment and renewed commitment to our chosen values. The goal isn't to eliminate suffering, but to suffer authentically, taking responsibility for what we can control while accepting what lies beyond our influence. Both philosophers ultimately suggest that meaningful existence comes not from finding perfect solutions to life's challenges, but from maintaining authentic engagement with those challenges. Their wisdom remains profoundly relevant because the fundamental structures of human existence, freedom, responsibility, mortality, the search for meaning, haven't changed, even as their specific manifestations continue to evolve. Part 10. Conclusion: two paths up the same mountain. Standing at the summit of our exploration, we can see clearly that Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre were not philosophical opponents engaged in an either-or debate, but rather complementary guides offering different routes up the same existential mountain. Both recognize the fundamental human predicament, thrown into existence without instruction manual or cosmic guarantee, and both develop sophisticated responses to this shared condition. Their apparent conflicts dissolve when we understand them as offering different tools for the same essential project: learn to live authentically in an uncertain world. Synthesis: tools for the existential toolkit. The genius of both philosophical approaches lies not in their claims to exclusive truth, but in their provision of practical tools for navigating existential challenges. Like a skilled craftsperson who needs different instruments for different tasks, we can benefit from having access to both Camusian and Sartrean insights as we confront the various situations life presents. Camus provides us with tools for acceptance and endurance. When we face circumstances we cannot change, illness, loss, failure, the fundamental limitations of human existence, his philosophy offers guidance for finding meaning within constraints rather than being crushed by them. The absurd hero's approach teaches us to continue creating, loving, and acting even when these activities cannot solve ultimate questions or guarantee lasting satisfaction. This wisdom proves invaluable during periods of suffering, disappointment, or existential crisis when the temptation toward despair or nihilism feels overwhelming. Sartre provides us with tools for transformation and transcendence. When we face circumstances that can be changed, our choices about career, relationships, political engagement, personal growth, his philosophy reminds us of our radical freedom and responsibility to create new possibilities. The authentic individual's approach teaches us to take full ownership of our choices and their consequences, while remaining committed to expanding freedom for ourselves and others. This wisdom proves essential during moments of decision, transition, or opportunity, when we need courage to embrace change and uncertainty. The synthesis of these approaches create a more complete framework for authentic living than either provides alone. We need Camus' acceptance when facing unchangeable realities, and Sartre's commitment to transformation when confronting changeable circumstances. We need the absurd hero's lucid indifference to outcomes combined with the authentic individual's passionate engagement with projects. We need the solitary strength that comes from individual confrontation with our condition, alongside the social wisdom that recognizes our fundamental interdependence. Complementary rather than contradictory, their philosophical differences, rather than representing fundamental contradictions, reflect different emphases within a shared commitment to authentic existence. Like two musicians improvising on the same theme, They explore different variations while maintaining harmony with underlying principles. Where Camus emphasizes limits, Sartre emphasizes freedom, but both recognize that authentic existence requires navigating the tension between constraint and possibility. Camus' limits aren't fatalistic resignation, and Sartre's freedom isn't naive optimism. Both understand that we must work within our circumstances while maintaining our capacity to transcend them. Where Camus focuses on individual authenticity and Sartre on social engagement, both recognize that personal meaning-making and collective responsibility are ultimately inseparable. Camus' solitary hero still acts in solidarity with others, while Sartre's social being must maintain individual authenticity to avoid bad faith. Where Camus advocates measured rebellion and Sartre champions committed activism, both seek to expand human dignity and freedom while avoiding the totalitarian temptations that can corrupt political movements. Their different strategies reflect different assessments of risk and possibility rather than fundamental disagreement about goals. These complementary emphases suggest that authentic existence might require different philosophical orientations at different times and in different circumstances. Some situations call for Camusian acceptance and endurance. Others demand Sartrean transformation and commitment. Some personalities gravitate naturally toward one approach or the other, but most of us need access to both as we navigate life's complexities. Personal choice and philosophical orientation. While both approaches offer valuable insights, individuals often find one philosophy resonating more deeply than the other. This preference isn't simply a matter of intellectual agreement, but reflects deeper temperamental and experiential factors that shape how we encounter existence. Those drawn primarily to Camus often possess what might be called a tragic sensibility, a deep awareness of life's limitations combined with determination to find beauty and meaning within those constraints. They may have experienced significant loss, illness, or disappointment that has taught them the importance of accepting what cannot be changed. They often find peace in solitary reflection and meaning in present moment experiences rather than future achievements. Those drawn primarily to Sartre often possess what might be called a transformative sensibility, a deep belief in human potential combined with commitment to realizing new possibilities. They may have experienced significant changes in their circumstances or witnessed the power of individual and collective action to create positive change. They often find energy in social engagement and meaning in working toward future goals rather than accepting current limitations. But these preferences need not become rigid identities. The person primarily drawn to Camus can benefit from Sartrean insights about freedom and social responsibility. The person primarily aligned with Sartre can gain from Camusian wisdom about acceptance and individual authenticity. The goal isn't to choose one philosophy exclusively, but to develop the capacity to draw on both as circumstances require. Moreover, our philosophical orientation may shift over time as our life experiences evolve. The young adult focused on transformation and possibility may later discover the wisdom of acceptance and limits. The person who has learned to accept constraints may later rediscover their capacity for radical choice and change. Both philosophies remain available as resources throughout the life journey. The ongoing human project, what ultimately unites Camus and Sartre, and what makes both remain relevant to contemporary readers, is their shared recognition that meaning-making is an ongoing human project rather than a problem to be solved once and for all. Neither offers a final answer to the question of how to live, because both understand that this question must be answered anew by each person in each generation. This ongoing quality of a human project reflects the fundamental structure of consciousness itself. As conscious beings, we cannot simply exist in the present moment like other animals. We are always projecting ourselves toward future possibilities while carrying the weight of past choices. We are condemned to be free, in Sartre's phrase, but this condemnation is also our glory because it means our existence continues to matter. The contemporary world presents us with new versions of eternal questions about meaning, freedom, and responsibility. Climate change, technological disruption, global interconnection, and other modern realities create novel contexts for ancient human challenges. But the fundamental work remains the same: learning to create meaning and live authentically despite uncertainty about ultimate purpose or final outcomes. Both philosophers remind us that this work is simultaneously individual and collective, We cannot create meaning for ourselves alone, because we exist in relationship with others who share our condition. But we also cannot derive meaning solely from collective projects, because authentic existence requires individual choice and responsibility. The ongoing human project requires both personal authenticity and social engagement, both acceptance of limits and commitment to transcendence. Embracing the challenge of authentic existence, the ultimate call to action that emerges from both philosophies, is surprisingly simple and extraordinarily demanding. Embrace the challenge of authentic existence. This means taking full responsibility for our choices, while acknowledging that we cannot control their outcomes. It means creating our own values while remaining open to genuine dialogue with others. It means accepting the tragic dimensions of existence while continuing to act, create, and love. Authentic existence doesn't promise to make life easier or more comfortable. Both philosophers are clear that it often makes life more difficult by forcing us to confront realities we might prefer to ignore. But authenticity offers something perhaps more valuable than comfort: the satisfaction of living with integrity, the joy of genuine creation, and the dignity that comes from taking responsibility for our own existence. This challenge extends beyond individual self-improvement to encompass our collective responsibility for creating conditions that enable authentic existence for all. If we are fundamentally interdependent beings, as both philosophers recognize in different ways, then individual authenticity and social justice are ultimately inseparable projects. Two voices, one truth. As we conclude this journey through their insights, we return to their own words to capture the essential unity underlying their apparent differences. Camus wrote, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." Sartre declared, "Man is nothing else than what he makes of himself." These statements initially seem to emphasize different things. Camus highlighting the intrinsic value of struggle, Sartre emphasizing human self-creation. But they converge on a deeper truth. Human existence finds its meaning not in achieving predetermined goals or discovering external purposes, but in the very act of engaging authentically with our condition. The struggle toward the heights that fills our hearts is simultaneously the process through which we make ourselves into who we become. The self-creation that defines human existence expresses itself through ongoing struggle with the challenges our condition presents. Both philosophers ultimately celebrate the same phenomenon: human consciousness engaging creatively and responsibly with the raw material of existence. Their legacy challenges us to continue this engagement with fresh courage and renewed commitment. In a world that often seems more absurd and more demanding of authentic choice than ever before, their insights remain not just relevant but essential. They remind us that the ancient human project of creating meaning in an uncertain world continues, and that this project, however difficult, remains worthy of our best efforts. The mountain of existence still awaits our climb. Whether we follow Camus' path of lucid acceptance or Sartre's route of radical commitment, or, more likely, some combination of both, the summit remains the same: a life lived with integrity, creativity, and authentic engagement with the fundamental challenges of being human. The struggle itself toward these heights remains, as both philosophers understood, enough to fill our hearts.